Our story begins with a magnificent and beautiful wedding witnessed by London's high society, where Edward, the eldest son of Admiral Morton and a naval officer himself, was to marry Elizabeth Dyer. She was the only daughter of the influential member of Parliament, Lord Dyer. Everyone was congratulating them and envying the union of this handsome couple. Rumor had it that Edward was as cold as ice, aloof and reserved. But the way he looked at Miss Dyer was filled with such pure tenderness that you couldn't believe he was the man from the rumors. Their meeting was thanks to the matchmaking of a certain lady, who was also present at the wedding, sitting alone to one side. Everyone in London knew her. She was the best matchmaker in the city, Miss Laura Pendleton. A little later, Miss Hyde approached her, and Laura gushed about how dreamlike the wedding was, how the bride and groom were like angels. But what was even more captivating was the blissful light shining in their eyes. That kind of look could make you believe in miracles. 12 years ago, when Laura met Elizabeth, she was just a child, but now she had blossomed into a true beauty. Pendleton was deeply moved to see Miss Dyer starting to build her own happiness and family like this. Now, the newlyweds were preparing to go on their honeymoon, and it was said they were going to Italy. Apparently, it was one of the most popular honeymoon destinations. Then, Miss Pendleton suggested that she and Miss Jane Hyde continue their previous conversation, which was about Fairfax, who looked like he would propose sometime this week. Thinking about it, the single lady let out a heavy sigh. Jane still had doubts about getting married. She was the second daughter of the Hyde family, and her older sister, Rosemary, was Laura's friend from boarding school. Jane loved cricket, horseback riding, and most importantly, she was a complete bookworm. One day, she received a letter from a man, a friend, who planned to propose to her. He would be visiting in a few days to formally ask for her hand. Jane knew he was a kind and decent gentleman, but she never thought he would fall in love with her. William Fairfax was the second son of an aristocratic family with ancient traditions who had made a fortune in trade. He had his own estate and lands, was tall and quite handsome. Everyone considered him a great catch, and any girl who received his proposal would think it a tremendous blessing. But some people felt burdened and doubtful about marriage, like Jane Hyde, who felt she wasn't ready. She also knew that if she refused him, William would be heartbroken. Miss Pendleton couldn't believe her friend was about to refuse such an offer. Her parents, after receiving William's letter, had already begun bustling with wedding preparations. They had even set a date. If Jane backed out now, they would be heartbroken. Perhaps she should just endure it and agree, but she hated feeling forced. Laura went on to explain that single life was hard, both in facing people's judgment and the financial pressure. But the most important thing was her feelings. Laura told her to set aside the outside world for a moment and listen to her own heart. Jane was still unsure if she was ready to marry William and spend the rest of her life with him. Just then, Mr. Fairfax appeared, interrupting them. He felt their conversation seemed quite lively and interesting. He came over, apologizing for the intrusion, and Jane's face turned bright red because she hadn't expected to see him. He even grew concerned seeing Miss Hyde's face turn almost purple, but she told him not to worry. She said she had just eaten something strange and was going to rest for a bit to feel better. William was relieved, but told her to ask if she needed any help. Laura felt a bit embarrassed, as she hadn't even noticed the gentleman's approach. Fairfax turned to her, remembering that she had gotten that Dumas novel for his sister Janet, and suggested she visit her. Then, after an apology, William confessed he had another matter he wanted to ask the ladies' help with, mentioning a young man of their age who also happened to be his brother-in-law. This man's name was Ian Dalton. He was quite famous and from Whitefield. Moreover, Laura had grown up with him and even attended the same school, and William had just received a letter from him. In the letter, Ian said he planned to come to London in about a month. Fairfax had also received a letter from Dalton's sister, in which she begged William to help her brother. She asked him to introduce her brother to some decent ladies during his stay in London. This was exactly what William was asking Miss Pendleton to do, which caught her a bit off guard, not knowing what to say. Meanwhile, Ian was completely unaware, not understanding why his sister and William were so eager to drag him into the London social scene. He just didn't think it was a big deal. Ian was the heir to the vast Whitefield estate in Yorkshire, and on top of that, he was an extremely shrewd businessman. In just a few years, he had more than quadrupled the fortune he inherited from his father. He was only 30 years old and already had all these titles and achievements. Laura wasn't sure if she was up to the task of matchmaking for such a person, or even if he himself was willing. William admitted that the whole thing was mostly due to pressure from his wife's sister, but he also knew that Laura herself wouldn't want to introduce her dear friends to a man who was equally uninterested in marriage. So he asked Miss Pendleton to start by simply accepting Ian as a new friend and, letting things take their course. The girl blushed a little but agreed, thinking it was a rather good proposal. For Mr. Fairfax to be so concerned, Dalton must be a true gentleman. She would have to deal with this matter later, but for now, she had more important things to do. And that matter concerned Miss Hyde. Soon, Miss Pendleton returned to her family's mansion, where the servants greeted her and asked how the wedding went. Her grandmother was resting on the second floor, and they said she was feeling a bit better than in the morning. Seeing the tray of snacks for the old lady, the girl decided to take it up herself. So, Laura went upstairs, knocked gently on the door first, and asked if her grandmother was asleep. The elderly relative was very happy to see her granddaughter and told her to come in quickly. As soon as she entered, the old woman wanted to know all the juicy details about the wedding. After hearing the story, she couldn't believe Edward had shed tears during the ceremony and regretted missing it. But the grandmother immediately recalled when the two first met, there was no sign of mutual attraction at all. That they became a couple so quickly was all thanks to Laura setting them up. She had already matched dozens of couples by now. She was truly a gifted matchmaker. The girl even blushed a little at her grandmother's praise. Then, the old woman looked at her granddaughter seriously and asked her to honestly answer an important question. The old woman had never seen a girl as beautiful inside and out as Laura, but she didn't understand why her granddaughter only used her talents on others and, for some reason, didn't seek a partner for herself. The grandmother was anxious that Laura was still single, and she felt it was because of that scoundrel who had abandoned her not long ago. She wanted an answer, but Laura didn't want to talk about it, only saying it was getting late. She told the old lady to rest well, kissed her forehead, and prepared to leave. After visiting her grandmother, Laura returned to her room and began to pray. She asked God to bless Morton and his girl's new beginning and to guide Hyde and Fairfax onto the right path. She also prayed for her grandmother's health and happiness. She even prayed for peace and prosperity for the man who had abandoned her 12 years ago. Shortly after, Laura received a letter from her friend Rosemary, who started by apologizing for her bluntness. She then explained that Mr. Fairfax had gone to Jane last week to propose, but as expected, the girl had refused him without hesitation. Her mother fainted on the spot, and Jane locked herself in her room, leaving Rosemary to handle everything. She asked if Laura had time to see Jane, as she desperately needed her now. So, Miss Pendleton got ready and set off to comfort the would-be bride and visit her friend. She couldn't refuse such a request. When she arrived, she immediately asked about Mrs. Hyde's condition. At this, Rosemary's face became quite serious. Their mother was in her room, and right after, they heard her shouting that she didn't want to see that old maid. She thought Laura was a self-righteous matchmaker who had almost ruined Jane's marriage and was now showing up triumphantly. The old woman even screamed that Laura had better not even think of coming near their family, and that they should never have dealt with an insignificant person with no family like her in the first place. When the shouting subsided a bit, Rosemary apologized and advised that it was best not to see her mother today. She was very sorry that Miss Pendleton had to go through all this and sincerely apologized. But Laura said she didn't mind and asked if she could visit Jane. To be honest, Mrs. Hyde's words did hurt a little. However, when Laura gave up on marriage at 25, she knew what people would think of her. Now in London, she was also known as the unmarriageable old maid, which was a bit insulting, but she didn't care. Arriving at Jane's door, the girl knocked and asked for permission to enter. From behind the door came the faint sound of shuffling feet, like an old woman approaching, and then the door slowly creaked open. Jane peeked out from the crack, looking as if she had been on a week-long spree. Laura was shocked by her condition. Moreover, the girl had clearly not eaten anything. Entering the room, Miss Pendleton explained that she had brought some delicious raspberry biscuits and suggested they share them. She pleaded with Jane not to ruin her health, no matter how much pain she was in, and to at least eat something. She also told her not to worry, that she understood she felt a little guilty about Mr. Fairfax. He seemed to have moved on, as he had gone hunting today. Suddenly, Jane asked Miss Pendleton if she had ever imagined her own future and what she would inherit. She confessed that she had no inheritance at all, which was a condition of being recognized as a member of the Pendleton family. Jane said in a sad voice that she wouldn't have any inheritance either. Since their father's death, their house had been slowly falling into disrepair. If things continued like this, they would have to move to the countryside. But she couldn't agree to the marriage because she didn't know how to do anything, and now she didn't understand why she had made that choice. She didn't even have a proper education and was always making mistakes. At 25, Miss Hyde felt she was good for nothing. In that era, this age was quite terrifying for any woman. It was too late to get married, and if you were unmarried and had no inheritance, you were basically doomed to a life of poverty. You might wake up one morning to find everything you knew was gone, leaving you thrown into the abyss of poverty and loneliness. There was nothing more terrifying than this fear, and Laura knew this feeling because she had experienced it too. But, hey, there are many ways to get through these difficulties. It's not the end of the world. You can get through it. Wiping the tears from Jane's cheeks, she swore that she could be anyone, a fortune teller, a street vendor. Hyde thought Miss Pendleton was joking with her, but she kept suggesting various ideas, one of which was to be a typist. Laura herself had intended to do so and even bought a typewriter, but later decided to become a private governess. Since her typewriter hadn't been used for a long time, she was willing to lend it to Miss Hyde. More importantly, she proposed that Jane come to her house for a few hours every day to practice typing. In just 3 months, Jane could find a job in any office that needed paperwork handled. After that, she could start earning her own money and even rent a room in a boarding house. Laura handed Jane a biscuit, hoping Miss Hyde would like the proposal. This did distract Jane a little from her gloomy thoughts, and she reached for the treat. And Miss Pendleton was just happy to be of some help to the would-be bride. A month had passed since then, and Mr. Dalton arrived at Fairfax's residence, where he was greeted with great enthusiasm by Ian. But Ian himself felt nothing special about returning to London. He noticed the city was noisier and more chaotic than before, which didn't leave a good impression on him. He couldn't figure out why William insisted on dragging him into this mess, as if he had nothing better to do. Fairfax explained that London was the cream of English society and told him to enjoy it. Besides, news of Dalton's arrival had already spread throughout London, and invitations were starting to pour in. But Ian refused to take part in any of it. He felt it would only be a hassle for him. In his opinion, everyone in high society just pretended to be important, but they were either boring snobs or complete idiots. Just then, William declared that Morton's ball was a must-attend and that he had already found a great ally for Ian. Ian wanted to find an excuse, but just gave his friend a scrutinizing look. Miss Pendleton was also getting ready for the ball, but the event made her a little anxious. Someone who always refused social gatherings would be there. And now he was going to appear at this ball, which was why so many people had suddenly RSVP'd to attend. It makes you think this guy is a real big shot, right? I just heard the maid chattering on about how William promised to bring Mr. Dalton. Suddenly, the maid stopped combing my hair, her eyes wide as if struck by inspiration. In fact, she did suggest a completely wild and chic hairstyle for my hair today. I agreed, and she kept whispering about how amazing this gentleman was and super rich. That meddlesome girl in her uniform was convinced that he would fall head over heels the moment he saw me. But I didn't think so. With so many young and beautiful women out there, I couldn't possibly compare. So, I told her to just do my usual hairstyle and to hurry up, the carriage was already waiting. The maid did as she was told, covering my hair with a beaded hairnet. Just as I was about to leave, she blurted out that I looked absolutely beautiful, exactly the same as when she first saw me 10 years ago. Laura was quite pleased with the maid's flattery and thanked her sincerely. Arriving at the ball, the girl noticed it was as crowded as ever. But Mr. Fairfax and Mr. Dalton were nowhere to be seen, probably not having arrived yet. But just as Laura thought this, William's voice came from behind her. He was happy to see her and said that this year's high society was packed from the very beginning. William had come with his sister Janet, but she had already ditched him and disappeared. Laura could tell from his demeanor that he had recovered from his heartbreak. Though he was thinner, he looked the same as always. However, she immediately asked where Mr. Dalton was at the moment. The man would be a little late, as he planned to meet with his university classmates. Fairfax bet his friend would show up any minute. A little while later, just as William was starting to worry he wouldn't come at all, Dalton finally arrived at the event. But Ian reminded him that he had important business and had warned him he would be late. The first thing he noticed was that it was just as noisy as he had imagined. But William wanted him to meet a particular lady. He said bluntly that he wasn't trying to set him up, just to introduce him to one of the kindest and most intelligent women in London. Ian wasn't so sure about the intelligent part, thinking his friend was mistaking good breeding for intelligence. I mean, the world is full of well-mannered women, but Dalton had yet to meet one who was truly intelligent. William pointed out that he was too harsh on women, which could get him into trouble. He always said things that were hard to respond to, which would make it impossible to build any relationship. Nevertheless, Fairfax just hoped Ian would put away his sarcasm for one night and say hello to his friend. He pulled Dalton to the other side of the room and pointed to Miss Pendleton. She was standing alone, and Fairfax apologized for keeping her waiting. Then he introduced his friend and brother-in-law, Ian Dalton of Whitefield. He then introduced the girl to Ian as Laura Pendleton, granddaughter of Countess Abigail, and she immediately began to size up her new acquaintance. A little earlier, she had told William that it seemed Dalton would be difficult to find a match for, as he wasn't interested in love. But Fairfax assured her that Ian just disliked high society. He had his own views on love, but he wasn't looking for the one, probably because he didn't believe in fate. However, Laura noted that of all the people she had ever met, this man was without a doubt the most handsome gentleman she had ever seen, and countless women would dream of a fairy tale romance with him. Then, a little while later, as the three of them were talking, Laura admitted she had heard a lot about Mr. Dalton. People thought he was a good uncle to his nephews and a good brother to his sister, but Ian just grew shy. He didn't think he was that good, especially after his sister had gone to such lengths to persuade him to come to this place. I mean, a normal brother wouldn't argue with his sister after she had gone through something like postpartum depression. Listening to him, Laura was convinced he was different, exceptionally elegant, and noble. These were qualities not seen in ordinary men, so it was clear he had a unique personality. Laura praised him for attending the ball, even though his sister wasn't in London. Dalton explained that there was still someone here helping his sister, and his name was William. It seemed Ian was just embarrassed by the praise and insisted he was actually a bad guy. I mean, this guy was never a saint in high society, right? But hearing him say that only made Miss Pendleton think he was even more humble. She explained that the reason Dalton had made a point of coming here was because he was thinking of his sister. Not many men would remember that their sister had postpartum depression, but Ian hadn't forgotten such things, which showed what a good brother he was. But sadly, this world would only eat such a person alive. William noticed Laura was making progress and mentally patted himself on the back for setting them up. Then he invited Miss Pendleton into the main hall, and Ian realized he had made the atmosphere a bit awkward. But he tried to get out of it, pretending he was just being polite and was curious about the lady. As the girl was leaving, he reminded her that she had promised to be his friend in London. He wanted to know exactly how she intended to show this friendship. Laura explained it was simple. When he visited, she would talk with him and introduce him to her friends. If he moved far away, she would keep in touch by writing letters, so he would always feel she was there for him. This was just a small part of what Laura could offer, but she also hoped he would be honest with her. He just smiled slightly and said that Miss Pendleton was just embarrassed by the praise. What she had just listed was the most precious thing in a friendship. The girl suddenly looked down in a fluster. Dalton smiled slightly and swore on his honor as a gentleman that he would be as honest as she wished. Afterward, he gently took her gloved hand and kissed it with a gentleman's bow. He looked up, but his body was still leaning forward, and added that he hoped he could count on Miss Pendleton. The girl smiled back, and, as a first step in their friendship, she offered to introduce him to her friends. Just as a dance was ending, she suggested Ian invite a lady for the next dance. Then Dalton confessed that he couldn't dance, and Laura realized she had said the wrong thing. William was stunned, wondering what on earth his friend had been doing in school to have even skipped dance lessons. I mean, all these ladies were watching him, and to just say hello but never dance, it's a bit rude. Suddenly, Laura asked if Mr. Dalton was good at sports. When William confirmed the guy was talented, she grabbed Ian's hand and pulled him along. Her plan was to give her confused new friend a crash course right away. So she invited Mr. Dalton to join her on the dance floor. Ian couldn't refuse, but reminded her that he was a really bad dancer and promised to step on her feet at least 3 times. She told him not to worry, assuring assuring him her feet were very sturdy. The music started, and Dalton knew he was completely done for. Laura just told him to concentrate, watch her feet, follow her rhythm, and take it slow. He was clumsy at first, but the guy was a quick learner and soon got the hang of it. He had good coordination, which helped a lot, and he quickly picked up the rhythm. Just in case, Laura reminded him that it was no big deal even if he stepped on her toes, and told him to relax a bit, as his nervousness was affecting his feel for the music. Then Miss Pendleton told him to lift his head and continue dancing, but to look into her eyes. Ian still felt awkward, worried he would mess up, but she was confident they would be fine soon. She noticed his dancing was quite natural and didn't understand why he had skipped dance classes in the first place. Dalton explained that his only dance partners had been sweaty men. That's why he didn't want to attend the classes, and as a result, he became a gentleman who, despite knowing it was impolite, was too timid to ask a lady to dance. Ian also confessed that he wasn't good at making proper conversation, falling far short of a true gentleman. But the girl pointed out that a person who respects others is a true gentleman. Mr. Dalton countered this, admitting he was a complete failure in that regard as well, seeing no respect for the social circle in his behavior. But Laura explained that the social circle was merely a place to relax. Having been in the social circle for 12 years, she had also experienced much exhaustion and embarrassment. She longed to avoid it all, but in London, that was simply impossible for a socialite. On the other hand, ladies have their own joys and happiness, and it would be wonderful to find someone to share them with. Even though people lead different lives, Laura still hoped to find someone to spend her later years with. Miss Pendleton believed that such things truly exist, believing in something abstract and intangible that you can't even see. Her conversation revealed a romantic view of marriage, and she had heard that Dalton felt the same way. William had told her so, and Ian agreed it was absolutely true. Laura also made it clear that for her, marriage was meaningless without sincere and deep love. She continued to tell Ian about the true emotions in a marriage until the dance ended. They had only known each other for an hour, but Laura realized she already felt a special connection. She saw Dalton as a decent and rare man who would take a lady's word seriously. This made her believe that Ian could also get along easily with other women, and she was completely convinced that this man would make a very good friend. After the dance, William came over and praised Miss Pendleton for giving a wonderful lesson. Laura then praised Ian's talent, saying he would have no problem dancing with other ladies. Seeing her friends on the other side of the room, she planned to introduce them to Mr. Dalton and asked him to wait a moment. Miss Pendleton immediately went over to them. Meanwhile, William told his friend that he had done even better than expected, but still didn't understand why Ian had never learned to dance before. Ian just felt embarrassed, as he felt he had been a bother to Miss Pendleton. Then, Laura brought over several ladies, and fortunately, he got along with them quite well. It was clear the atmosphere had indeed become much more relaxed. One of the ladies, Miss Dora Lenz, looked particularly charming tonight. People called her the social butterfly. Laura believed that she and Mr. Dalton would make an absolutely perfect pair. As the conversation was getting lively, Miss Pendleton decided it was time to leave. She told William her work for the day was done, and Fairfax offered to arrange a carriage for her. But Laura declined, as her carriage was already waiting outside. She invited him and Mr. Dalton to visit when they were free, saying her grandmother would surely like young men like him. William promised he would arrange it. As Laura got into her carriage, she glanced back at the building, wondering if Ian had already asked Miss Lenz to dance. But Dora was the type to take the initiative, because you simply couldn't be indifferent to someone like Dalton. You know, the girl hoped they would become the most dazzling couple in all of London. Just as she was about to leave, the carriage door was suddenly yanked open. Laura was naturally startled, and at first had no idea what was happening. But what truly stunned her was seeing Mr. Dalton standing there, out of breath. His hair was even a bit messy from running so fast, and he looked extremely worried. She immediately barraged him with questions, asking what had happened and why he was in such a hurry to see her. She found it a bit strange, as he was supposed to be dancing with the other ladies right now. But he accused her of sneaking away without a word the moment his attention was diverted. After all, she was his first dance partner, and he didn't understand why it was so difficult to say goodbye before leaving. The girl understood what he meant, but was still a bit flustered. she still apologized, saying she felt they would see each other again soon. So a farewell didn't seem that important. When Dalton heard "see each other again soon," you could tell from his expression that it was exactly what he wanted to hear most. Laura explained that her family often held evening parties for young people, with live musicians and so on. These gatherings were very relaxed, and Laura was planning to invite Dalton and Fairfax. But she didn't insist, knowing Mr. Dalton might be busy. She also mentioned that these events were usually organized formally by her grandmother. But since her grandmother wasn't in good health, all the planning was handled by Laura. Ian seemed completely relieved and promised he would visit them soon. He even hoped for tomorrow, which surprised Laura, as she thought he hated social events. However, she explained they had a doctor's appointment tomorrow, but the day after would be perfectly fine. This made Mr. Dalton very happy. He gratefully and with extreme gentleness kissed her hand, wishing her a safe journey. He didn't seem to be in any hurry to let go of her hand. They said their goodbyes. On the way back, Miss Pendleton kept glancing at the hand he had kissed. It was then that she suddenly realized there was more to this man than meets the eye. I mean, they had just met, and he was kind enough to see her off better than she could have imagined, which made her feel this could be the beginning of a truly long-lasting friendship. As for Mr. Dalton, he stood there, watching her carriage until it disappeared from sight. He could almost still feel Laura's hand in his, and something wonderful was stirring within him. As soon as news spread that Mr. Dalton had attended the Mortons' ball, high society was in an uproar. Everyone was practically scrambling to invite him to their own parties. But one person stood out in particular, and that was Dora Lenz. Her mother was also very keen on the matter, questioning her about every detail of her meeting with Dalton. Yesterday, Dora had gushed that Dalton was more handsome and charming than anyone had said. Moreover, he had promised to attend their dinner party tonight. Besides, Dora was the only one at the ball whom Ian hadn't given the cold shoulder. Mrs. Lynn said, "My dear, you've really caught a big fish. He'll be a great catch at the dinner party." The Baron Lenz's dinner parties were a major event in London. On the surface, it was just about enjoying lavish food prepared by the best chefs in town, but it was also an opportunity to meet the Baron's very popular and beautiful daughter. Because the Baron was known for being obsessed with his title and extremely picky about whom he invited. Mrs. Lenz remembered that the Whitefield estate alone was a huge gold mine. As soon as Ian got the property, he started investing in profitable mines and railway bonds. So no matter what happened, the man would never go bankrupt. Dora realized her mother was dead, set on marrying her off to a rich man, and Mr. Dalton was her target. But Dora had no intention of marrying without a real flutter of the heart, much to her mother's disappointment. Her mother explained that if Dora just sat around waiting for that flutter, other women would snatch Mr. Dalton from right under her nose. Besides, he might also set his sights on a girl from a wealthier family than theirs. She asked Dora to recall how Mr. Dalton's eyes had stared at her with adoration at the ball. But because she was busy flirting, she hadn't noticed at all that he was actually looking at Laura, who was standing behind her. She couldn't figure out why, if he was so captivated, he didn't ask her to dance and then ran after Miss Pendleton instead. I mean, he only danced with her at the ball. But her mother claimed it was because he was still unfamiliar with the whole social scene. Maybe he only mingled with old maids like Pendleton, but it was too early to draw conclusions. And don't forget how Mr. Dalton had looked at Dora. Dora remembered that she had indeed never met anyone who didn't like her, so maybe her mother was right. Ian had been very nice to her, always smiling whenever he looked at her. In her own twisted fantasy, she thought the man was already head over heels for her and ready to make her his wife. But while Dora was lost in her dream world, many others were keeping a close eye on Ian. In the 2 weeks following that ball, Dalton's every move, every event he attended, seemed to revolve around getting closer to Miss Pendleton. He appeared at her party again, and his eyes would practically light up whenever Laura approached. But it seemed Miss Pendleton herself didn't see anything beyond pure friendship in that look. Besides, she was a bit surprised that he had come today at all, as it was pouring rain outside, and she thought he would have stayed home. But that didn't stop Ian. The only ones who really suffered were the coachman and the horses. The question now was what to do, since the weather was so bad that no one else had bothered to come. Ian was actually thrilled because now he could spend more time with Miss Pendleton, which he considered a complete bonus. The girl welcomed him warmly and was about to pour him some hot tea. Meanwhile, the other aristocrats were getting restless because Dalton had been here for so long. It was a hassle trying to get a meeting with him, but at the same time, they felt a strange sense of relief. People speculated that if he was always with this London matchmaker, then he must be looking for a bride. Ian Dalton had little idea that Laura was just playing the role of a matchmaker. Watching him, the girl began to notice that the man seemed completely uninterested in finding a wife. She was curious about what he was really thinking, as he never missed a single tea party or dinner at their house. She had introduced him to her friends many times, and they had spent a lot of time together, but he never showed interest in any of the ladies, merely exchanging a few words with them. Then he would go back to listening to Miss Pendleton play the piano and engage in some casual conversation with her. Often, the girl began to feel he was more inclined towards friendship than love. That evening, Laura remembered he hadn't liked London at first and was curious about what he thought of it now. He admitted that at first, he had really wanted to return to Whitefield, but now he liked it here and had experienced a lot. In her conversations with him, Laura heard many stories about his hometown, Whitefield. It was an estate surrounded by dense forests, with a mansion situated on a small hill right in the center. When Mr. Dalton talked about his home, she felt as if she were standing on that very hill. It was as if she could just look out the window and see the dense birch forest and the fields in the distance. You could also hear the sincere and warm emotion in Mr. Dalton's voice. Laura realized that Ian truly cherished his homeland. Most aristocrats didn't even know how much land they owned, and hardly anyone genuinely cared about their estates. The more Miss Pendleton listened to Dalton, the more she believed that this place was truly special. The man also confirmed that the beauty of his hometown could hardly be described in words. He suggested that Laura should go see it for herself one day, but for now, he had a slightly different way to show it to her. He glanced at the bare wall and proposed giving the girl a landscape painting. Laura loved the idea, but she was even more shocked when she found out that the paintings were actually done by Ian himself. Unfortunately, due to the weather, he hadn't brought his sketchbook today, or else he could have shown Laura Whitefield through his drawings. He also wanted to tell her about his nephews and nieces, and it turned out Miss Pendleton was eager to hear about them. Ian started with the eldest, Henry, who was born when Dalton was not yet 8 years old. He was now studying at Cambridge, where Ian himself had graduated from, but they only met occasionally. The second was his niece, Olivia Fairfax. She was already 13, but more mature than her peers, and dreamed of entering high society. Since she was very sensible, she probably wouldn't cause any trouble. The real problem was the two little ones, 10-year-old Daniel and 8-year-old George. They were very mischievous, and fights were almost a daily occurrence, though I suppose boys of that age are all like that. Even so, these two little ones would cross the line, and only Ian could keep them in check. Laura suddenly became interested in the youngest child, who was born just a year ago. The baby was adorable, although his mother had suffered a great deal to give birth to him. Ian's sister was better now, but deep down, Dalton hoped this would be her last child. Miss Pendleton, who liked children, decided to give a book as a gift for the youngest nephew. However, to give a gift, she needed to know the recipient's name, so she asked what the little one was called. It turned out he was named after Mr. Dalton, called Ian, but with the surname Fairfax. Laura thought this was wonderful and wanted to pick a gift that would truly suit him. This also made her fall into thought again, as Mr. Dalton kept revealing new sides to his character. He could be harsh in his criticism, but he held a strong and tender love for those he cared about. He had a broad worldview, yet he focused his love on a limited group of people. This man was the perfect husband material, but for some reason, he wasn't interested in ladies. However, when he finally did want to find love, Laura would pray that the path would lead him to the one he was destined for. At that very moment, the maid, Anne, who was serving them tea, started towards the door, but she lingered there, watching them with a suspicious look. Several months had passed since that day. As Miss Pendleton was getting ready to go out, the maid knocked on the door and saw that she was already prepared, and apologized for not coming sooner, explaining she hadn't realized her mistress was getting ready on her own. But Laura wasn't angry and just asked for help with the final touches on her outfit. Besides, it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. She had simply seen the fine weather and decided to get some fresh air. And Mr. Dalton had also suggested she enjoy the fresh air. At the mention of the man waiting in the drawing room, the maid became a little flustered. She pointed out that the gentleman seemed to be visiting quite often lately. Laura explained that he just came for private conversations, and this was the perfect place for it, and handed her mistress a wide-brimmed hat with a huge flower, suggesting she wear it. Although Laura felt the hat was a bit too extravagant for a walk, it did make the line of her neck look more elegant. So Miss Pendleton convinced the maid to fetch another accessory. Then, and finally spoke up, saying the gentleman was visiting for a completely different reason. One possibility was that he really liked the food here and wanted to kidnap the cook, but turned serious and said the other reason was that Ian was interested in someone he had met here. Laura was clueless, having no idea who it could be. Then the maid practically spelled it out. "It's you, miss." Now Laura understood why the maid had suggested the fancy hat, so she would look especially charming, and agreed, saying that if her mistress looked more elegant, Mr. Dalton would be defenseless. Miss Pendleton was still unconvinced, as she had never seen that kind of emotion in his eyes. It was more likely that his attention was focused on Germaine's cooking. Laura thought, and was no expert on emotions, and had no idea what was really going on. The maid, however, was certain she wasn't mistaken because she could see how Mr. Dalton looked at her mistress when she wasn't paying attention. Just now, when she came out to greet him and lowered her eyes, Ian gave her that look again. It was a look one only gives to someone they truly care about. The maid felt sorry for her mistress, who could help others with their love lives, but couldn't see her own. Meanwhile, the two had stepped outside, and Laura noted the weather was much better than last week. Just a few days ago, when they had dinner with the Mortons, it had been quite cold. Ian commented that they were a perfect couple, like two halves of a whole, complementing each other perfectly. Mr. Morton himself seemed a bit cold and not very talkative, but his wife really softened the atmosphere, and Edward cared for her with such tenderness. Mr. Dalton guessed that Miss Pendleton must be very proud of this family. After all, it was she who had helped bring such a harmonious couple together. Ian had heard this from Mr. Morton himself. According to Edward, he would never have been able to marry his beloved wife if not for Miss Pendleton. Laura blushed, feeling he was exaggerating. They had just met at social gatherings, and he was merely being polite. But Mr. Dalton had already noticed that Miss Pendleton's kindness helped her friends build harmonious families. These days, many people married without any real understanding, just for money and dowries, which led to a lifetime of unhappiness and made Miss Pendleton's kindness all the more significant. Hearing these words, the girl became even more flustered, her cheeks turning bright red. Ian noticed Laura was embarrassed, and normally in such situations, a gentleman would change the subject. But Dalton enjoyed seeing her like this, because he was definitely not like other gentlemen. Then Laura asked him to stop showering her with praise. She confessed that she had actually been plotting with Mr. Fairfax to introduce Mr. Dalton to one of her friends and set them up for marriage. That's why she kept inviting him to various events, trying to introduce him to different people, and even taught him to dance so he could actually spend time with the ladies. The girl realized she had let the cat out of the bag, as she and William had agreed to keep it a secret. Now, Mr. Dalton would probably think she was a cunning person, but then Laura noticed a look of satisfaction on his face. From the way he was smirking at her, Miss Pendleton guessed he already knew everything. But Ian apologized, saying he just appreciated her honesty. This made her blush even more, so embarrassed she could have died. Just then, a carriage passed by, carrying a noble lady. She was visibly startled when she saw the handsome, dark-haired man on the street. It was Dora Lenz, and she recognized the gentleman as Mr. Dalton. But the two of them didn't even notice that someone had just been staring at them. Laura apologized for secretly trying to set Ian up, but he wasn't angry. On the contrary, he was grateful, as she was only trying to help. However, the girl realized her efforts were in vain, now that she understood he had no intention of marrying. Then, she was surprised again when she heard he wasn't against marriage at all. He himself had been trying to find a suitable girl in Whitefield, and she didn't necessarily have to be a perfect beauty. It was just that he had never managed to find someone he could open his heart to. Hearing this, Miss Pendleton even became happy, realizing he was probably looking for his soulmate. Ian clarified that he was talking about his soulmate exactly, someone he would meet by chance. I guess that's what you call believing in fate, right? Laura immediately suggested he try his luck in London and even offer to help him. Mr. Dalton smiled slightly, thanked her, but declined her offer. It wasn't that he was against arranged meetings. In fact, he wasn't opposed to them, but he was tired of meetings determined by circumstances. He felt that such an encounter should happen in a different way. He paused and looked at Laura intently. She noticed his strange behavior, but didn't know what was causing it, especially since he had suddenly become so serious. Just then, a familiar voice came from behind her, and Miss Lenz stepped out of her carriage. She had decided she couldn't just pass by and wanted to enjoy the beautiful weather with them, but she was currently running errands in town. Laura noticed that Dora looked particularly charming today, with a shyer expression than usual. Miss Lenz immediately turned to Mr. Dalton with a flirtatious smile. She first asked if he planned to stay in London for a while longer, but Ian couldn't say for sure. So Dora explained that the ball and party season was approaching, and she and her friends had already arranged some activities. She invited Ian to join them, where they could go boating, swimming, and relax at picnics. To seal the deal, Dora suddenly invited Miss Pendleton as well. Laura was happy to go, which led Mr. Dalton to accept Miss Lenz's invitation. Miss Pendleton herself immediately noticed something different about Dora's behavior. She had always been proud and independent, but now she was being unusually forward and talkative with the gentleman. There might be something between these two, but it was clear that her interest in Ian was far greater than his in her. With that said, Miss Lenz bid her friends farewell, as she had to go, but she still made sure to invite them to her event, and as the carriage pulled away, her smile was aimed entirely at Ian. Mr. Dalton admitted that Dora was indeed a charming lady, and Laura added that she was smart and talented, which made her irresistible to any gentleman. But Miss Pendleton was a little worried deep down because in the past, Ian always seemed distant whenever Dora was around, but now she could see he wasn't treating Miss Lenz badly. Ian suddenly declared that the worst part of being here, for him, was William. But the girl disagreed, thinking he was important, and reminded him about her friend, Miss Hyde, the one who had rejected him, though Fairfax was doing quite well now. Even after hearing she was looking for a job, he still offered her a position at his firm, saying he didn't want to lose her as a friend. Besides, his request for her to find a bride for Dalton had actually helped Laura find a good friend herself. Ian smiled slyly, agreeing that William's actions were indeed quite noble. As a thank you, Laura decided to invite Fairfax to the picnic as well, and Ian joked that he could be used to row the boat. A little while later, they returned to the estate, and Miss Pendleton asked Ian for a cup of tea. He wanted to stay, but he had urgent business to attend to and had to take his leave. But before leaving, he wanted to ask the girl a question. For some reason, Mr. Dalton was curious whether William had ever shown any interest in Miss Pendleton. She found the question strange and reminded him again of what had happened between William and Jane. Besides, Miss Hyde was her dearest friend, so she felt it was wrong to even entertain such a thought. Seeing the pure sincerity in Laura's words, a peaceful smile appeared on Ian's face. Having quelled his subconscious jealousy, Mr. Dalton bid Miss Pendleton farewell. The girl watched him leave for a moment, still not fully understanding why he felt the need to clarify the matter. After returning home, she kept thinking about Ian and Miss Lenz's relationship. Mr. Dalton's restrained reaction still bothered her, especially compared to Dora's forwardness. Still, maybe that was just how the fellow expressed his affection, hiding his feelings in front of others and only revealing them when they were alone. However, if that wasn't the case, then Miss Lenz had misunderstood Mr. Dalton's feelings. She was undoubtedly a brilliant and multi-talented person, but she lacked life experience and was susceptible to flattery. For example, if someone said something like, "Wow, they're a perfect match. They have to be together, you know." But then Laura thought, no, my idea is too foolish. Dora was level-headed and a person of taste, and perhaps the fact that Dalton no longer needed a matchmaker meant he was already interested in Miss Lenz. At this thought, Miss Pendleton snipped the rose she was fiddling with in two with a snip of her scissors. The bud fell to the ground, like a dream that had just slipped through her fingers. But she kept telling herself that, all in all, the pairing would be ideal. Miss Lenz had no money and no dowry, but she was the daughter of a great man with a title, and Mr. Dalton was very wealthy. So on the surface, they were a perfect match, right? So now, as the one who brought them together, all Laura could do was watch from the sidelines. A few days later, Jane Hyde came to visit Miss Pendleton. She immediately apologized for being a little late, saying it was because the carriage traffic was so heavy. She remembered there was a grand party at Baron Bailey's that evening and asked if Miss Pendleton planned to attend. Laura had received an invitation, but she had to stay with her grandmother, whose health was declining. Besides, she would rather stay home and read quietly, listening to the sound of the typewriter, than go to some dinner party. party. Then, Laura told her friend that she was doing great at her new job, and today she suggested increasing the difficulty a bit, as she knew Jane could handle it. It had been 2 months since Miss Hyde started coming to her office to learn typing. The first time she came, she couldn't stop praising the place. I mean, there were piles of books there too. And the small room felt like a real miniature library. Then Laura showed her the typewriter Jane would be using to produce documents in the future. This treasure was a second-hand find Miss Pendleton had picked up when passing by a closed-down firm. You see, she had also been in Jane's shoes, with no idea how to make a living. She quickly learned to type, and then a friend taught her how to create document templates. Laura had thought about opening her own firm, but realized it wasn't for her. Still, the skill had served her well. Now, Miss Pendleton could pass these skills on to Jane. She was curious how Miss Hyde planned to use this thing in the future, and whether she was willing to put in the effort. Since Miss Hyde had already had quite a few lessons, Laura was ready to teach her how to type. Laura was very impressed with her work. She hadn't expected such a quick and excellent transformation. Jane thanked her for her instruction every time, saying she thought she would die in the first few months, but after a while, things actually started to work out. And she really liked Miss Pendleton's tough love teaching style. Laura put great passion into the lessons and taught with even more enthusiasm. Suddenly, Jane noticed Miss Pendleton flipping through a book and writing something in a notebook. It turned out Laura was learning Latin at the same time, which was complete gibberish to Miss Hyde. Then Laura showed her the other books she was studying, including the Aeneid, the Odyssey, and the Iliad. Seeing Jane's shocked expression, Laura confessed that she had already learned Greek back in school. Although schools usually only taught German and French, for this reason, Latin and Greek courses were also offered. With the help of a dictionary, Miss Pendleton could already translate text like an expert. Jane kept gasping because she couldn't understand a single damn word. With a mind like that, she should have gone to Oxford, but Laura couldn't enroll directly. But she could help others get in and become their private tutor. It was then that Jane realized that while she was just practicing typing, Miss Pendleton was already planning serious business for herself. She was always so calm and composed, looking every bit a true lady. But no one realized that she was actually fighting harder for her future than anyone else. Hearing about Miss Pendleton's new plan, Jane finally saw how smart she was. I mean, she was a top student at school and spoke fluent French, but Laura still felt it wasn't enough. Miss Hyde was surprised again, because any family with a daughter would be fighting to have a governess like that. The problem was, some families were financially strapped, and they were prepared to sacrifice their daughter's education. That's why teaching girls paid less than teaching boys, so she needed to know more languages. Miss Pendleton really liked the work and thought of being a governess for life. But, hey, if she had to give it up one day, she could always try teaching at a school, work there until retirement, buy a small house in the countryside, and live out her days in leisure. Jane was extremely impressed listening to Miss Pendleton plan out her entire future like that. She herself was only thinking about her current mess and hadn't even considered what to do next. Laura offered her a few words of encouragement, saying she knew Jane could handle it. Just then, she received a letter from Miss Lenz, inviting her to a picnic. Jane had received one too, but wasn't sure if she should go, as she and Dora weren't particularly close. But Miss Pendleton said, "You work so hard, you should relax sometimes." Considering Jane and William, Laura felt the picnic was a perfect opportunity for those two. There was nothing between them but a bit of awkwardness, so they could become good friends again. Besides, it would also make it easier for Miss Hyde to find a job in the future. As Laura and Jane engaged in a silent battle of wills, time ticked by. Then, the day of Miss Lenz's meticulously planned picnic finally arrived. Miss Pendleton and Miss Hyde arrived on time. Mr. Dalton and Mr. Fairfax were already there. Once everyone had gathered, Dora had them get into the carriages, but with the ladies in the carriage up front. William thought Miss Lenz looked stunning today and vowed to try his best to impress her. But Ian interpreted this as him having to drive the carriage himself. It seemed Fairfax was arranged to ride in the same carriage as Miss Pendleton. He smiled and bid his friend a temporary farewell, wishing him a good time today. William slowly walked over to Laura and asked if he could escort her and Miss Hyde, to which they gladly agreed. The fellow was very polite to them, helping them into the carriage. even offering his hand. Mr. Dalton stood by, watching all of this with his stomach churning, because another man had touched Miss Pendleton's hand, even if it was just a polite gesture to help. Just as he was about to lose his mind and scream at the damn world, the ladies distracted him, or more precisely, Miss Lynn's, who reminded him that they should get going too. Dalton agreed, thinking it was wise to strengthen his connection with Miss Pendleton's friends. So he went to help the ladies into the carriage, knowing in his heart that it was going to be a long day. Soon, Mr. Dalton, sitting in the driver's seat, overheard the ladies whispering. They were secretly sizing Ian up and found that the rumors about his looks were absolutely true, even an understatement. The fellow was handsome. Furthermore, the ladies noted that when he was with Miss Lynn's, the two of them looked like a masterpiece. They began to wonder why Mr. Dalton no longer accepted Miss Lynn's dinner invitations. The fellow didn't want to reveal his heart, only saying that some very important matters always came up. The girls didn't believe it, as being invited to the Lynn's household was a big deal. But they guessed he liked spending time at Miss Pendleton's house, seeing as he was always there. They couldn't figure out what was so interesting there, aside from chatting about books or music. On the other hand, the food there was absolutely divine. The ladies even licked their lips, recalling the feast from the last dinner party. They knew Miss Pendleton wasn't a foodie, so they couldn't understand why her family would spend so much on food, instead of arranging a decent wedding for their own granddaughter. You know, one of the ladies told us to keep it down, as Miss Pendleton might hear, although all of London was already buzzing with gossip. There were rumors that old Mrs. Pendleton hadn't put up a single penny for her granddaughter's dowry. Laura's looks allowed her to be accepted by society as a true aristocrat, but not a single man had proposed. It must be because of the lack of a dowry. The girls just couldn't figure out why her family didn't arrange a marriage for her. Suddenly, one of the ladies remembered something about Laura's mother, though to be honest, she wasn't entirely sure if it was true. Just as she was about to spill the secret, the carriage stopped, and Mr. Dalton announced to the ladies that they had arrived at the picnic spot. The other carriages arrived one after another, and soon all the guests dispersed to admire the view of the open lawn. Picnic blankets were already laid out for them, and Dora asked everyone to sit in groups. All right, for everyone who wants to go straight to the water, Miss Lynn's asks you to head over to the boats. Dora noticed Mr. Dalton kept glancing towards Miss Pendleton. It seemed he was still hung up on that conversation. Their earlier conversation, it was probably when her friend Victoria brought up Laura's mother that caused the trouble. Then, Miss Lynn suddenly called out to Ian, inviting him for a walk, which caught him completely off guard, but in a good way. He seized the opportunity, because this wasn't just a picnic stroll, it was a chance to be alone with Miss Pendleton. He was screaming and cheering with joy on the inside, but on the surface, he tried to remain calm. To break the ice, Ian once again took the lead in the conversation, asking her to answer a question about the conversation in the carriage, when the girls were talking about Miss Pendleton's mother. He thought that as Laura's close friend, Miss Lynn's probably wouldn't feel it was appropriate to reveal her private affairs. He cherished his friendship with Miss Pendleton just as Dora did, so he felt he needed to know because he was considering seeing her again. She admitted that she didn't know the full details of the story, as she had heard it secondhand. It was said that Miss Pendleton's mother was the apple of her family's eye, and men would line up just to get a glimpse of her. But when she was 17, she vanished into thin air. Rumor has it that she eloped with an American painter. They had invited the fellow to their home to paint her portrait because he was incredibly talented. They were supposed to get married, but they never made it to the altar and ran off together. Then the lady died while giving birth to Laura. The artist left the child with her grandmother, Lady Abigail, and then left again. Everyone assumed he had abandoned his daughter to start a new life. And just like that, Miss Laura was officially accepted into the Pendleton family. Mr. Dalton listened to the story without a word, clearly shocked, which was not surprising. Miss Lynn's herself felt sorry for Laura, because she could have had a brilliant life if her birth hadn't been such a scandal. Then the girl added that Miss Pendleton was actually very noble and virtuous, and her upbringing and background were as good as a true aristocrat's. But because of her birth, she had no dowry. When she was accepted by the family, her uncle insisted that they would only take her on the condition that the inheritance would go to his son. So Miss Pendleton was left without a penny, and Dora asked Mr. Dalton not to be too harsh on her. Dora meant that even if she had commoner's blood, she asked Ian to see Laura for who she truly was. But but he assured her that Miss Lenz had misunderstood him. He had no intention, nor was it even possible, for him to look down on the girl for something so trivial. He was just shocked that such a noble lady had such a messy past. But now he understood why Miss Pendleton was always so reserved. Dora noticed that Ian was trying to hide his frustration at having to deal with such a woman. There must be a reason why he was suddenly so concerned about Miss Pendleton's background, right? Ian still thanked Dora for the information. Just then, her friend Victoria appeared and suggested they go play together. Mr. Dalton was invited too, but he declined. He just walked away, and Miss Lenz was frustrated that she had so little time with him, even for just a chat. But on the bright side, she would always remember the time they had alone. Meanwhile, Ian, who had walked away, was thinking that he had been in London for much longer than he had planned. Moreover, he was wasting his time on this boring nonsense while a mountain of work was piling up at the estate. But for some reason, he was still here, even though he didn't have to be. As he pondered this, his gut told him there was only one reason he was staying. Laura Pendleton was taking up more and more space in his mind. To be honest, the past month had been one surprise after another. And Dalton, like a complete fool, had been orbiting Laura, hoping to get a word out of her. But he didn't ask her anything, just babbled on and on like a waterfall. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be captivated. And it had to be this girl, of all people, the one looked down upon by everyone. As he expected, the entire high society circle was full of small-minded people, which was evident from the conversation in the carriage. They took pleasure in dissecting other people's business and would never be satisfied with that kind of trashy gossip. Perhaps Laura's quiet and reserved nature was just the result of years of being belittled and ignored. It was a miracle she had survived in this world, completely alone and without any support. Dalton wondered if there was anyone at all who could offer her any comfort. He wanted to be that person for Miss Pendleton, even if just for a little while. He wanted to listen to all her pain and do whatever it took to make her feel better. Ian was lost in thought, but he could still hear a voice counting. It was William skipping stones, but he still couldn't beat the ladies. He was sure he could do it. It was just that this stone was too heavy. Just then, Ian walked up and told him to fix his posture before blaming the stone. Everyone on the beach turned their heads to watch Mr. Dalton approach. Miss Pendleton was especially happy to see him and immediately invited him to join their stone game. She bet on Miss Hyde to win and suggested Ian bet on Mr. Fairfax, but he decided to bet on the lady as well. William got excited, claiming he had won at least one round, and asked Miss Hyde to back him up. Jane seemed a little unsure of his skills, and then asked if Dalton wanted to play against her. Ian was happy to play, but joked that he was nervous to compete against a master. Then Miss Pendleton asked him, even promising to bet on him this time, if he agreed. This fired him up, and he was ready to play. As William complained that Laura was underestimating his skills, Ian gave everyone a sly glance. He then explained to his complaining friend that it wouldn't hurt Fairfax's reputation at all if he won. So he approached the water's edge, as Miss Hyde wanted him to go first. Ian wasn't sure if he could do it. It had been a while since he'd done this sort of thing. Nevertheless, he got ready, and everyone held their breath. Mr. Dalton swung his arm, and the stone skipped across the water like a rubber ball on a smooth floor. Laura started counting and got to 38 skips. It was incredible. Miss Pendleton announced that Ian had set a new record for the game today. But Miss Hyde was lost in thought because she was quite good at this too, and she decided there was no way she was letting this fellow steal her champion title. As she prepared to throw, William was the one cheering the loudest for her, but she didn't even notice. She was completely focused on calculating the trajectory. And just like that, the stone skipped 40 times across the water, according to Laura's count. Jane finally breathed a sigh of relief, and Miss Pendleton declared her the record-breaking champion. William immediately came over, curious as to how she had accomplished the feat. It was pure luck, but she kept talking about the round with Fairfax. Seeing that the conversation was going on, Mr. Dalton suggested to Miss Pendleton that they find something else to do. So they went boating, which sounded wonderful on such a warm day. Ian remembered he had wanted to make William their boatman, but had completely forgotten in his obsession with the game. But Laura told him not to worry about it, as they were having fun anyway. Then Ian realized that the two of them were alone in the boat, and he knew he was done for. and their knees were almost touching, but he felt it was just because the boat was too small. What really unnerved him was the silence around them. Then he realized that rowing had never felt so tense. He glanced back at Miss Pendleton, who looked incredibly happy against the backdrop of the scenery, and his mind went blank. Ian decided to change the subject to Miss Hyde, remembering there were two high society sisters. Laura confirmed that one of them had indeed rejected William, but now they were casually skipping stones together. She and Jane happened to be walking with Fairfax when he suggested it. But Miss Pendleton was happy now that those two could have fun together again, without any awkwardness. They had always been friends, and Laura believed William had proposed out of friendship, not love. Suddenly, Mr. Dalton became very serious and asked, "Is it possible for a couple to find happiness if their relationship is based only on friendship?" She thought it was possible, but such people were extremely rare. Ian still had a hard time understanding. He believed marriage should be about love, not just some sort of buddy-buddy relationship. But then again, Miss Pendleton believed that love also caused a lot of arguments. So she thought mutual trust was far more important than fleeting, intense passion. She wasn't against love and marriage, but she believed love would quickly fade under the heavy weight of poverty. But even a marriage that starts with love can eventually turn into a solid friendship, you know? The words were wise, but Mr. Dalton couldn't blindly agree. He believed love was a feeling worth suffering for, even with all the trouble that came with it. Otherwise, couples who stayed together after the passion faded would just end up in some kind of lifeless routine. Ian believed that some feelings are so strong they can last until the final moments of one's life. Laura admitted she also believed in the power of love and said that Mr. Dalton would one day find such a love. The man was suddenly lost in thought, noticing how close he was sitting to Miss Pennington. He felt he would have been much more relaxed around her if it weren't for this, but now he was fighting a strange impulse. Looking at her hand resting casually on the bench, he really wanted to touch it. Seeing the sunlight on her face, Ian wanted only to kiss it to become that ray of sun. He was so lost in his thoughts that his strange expression even startled Miss Pennington. She even worried if he was ill. Meanwhile, he was mentally cursing himself for having those thoughts about the unsuspecting girl beside him. Laura, already frightened by his pale face and the beads of sweat on his forehead, managed to persuade him to disembark on the shore, holding his arm, not believing him when he said he felt better. Yes, he said so, but the poor fellow was actually so scared his legs were trembling and his ears were practically smoking. Laura saw a rock under a nearby tree and suggested Mr. Dalton sit down and rest for a bit. As he tried to compose himself, she hovered around him like a mother hen, just short of clucking. Dalton knew that if they kept looking at each other like this, he would completely lose control. To think of something else to talk about, Ian asked Miss Pennington to sit next to him, and this way, he wouldn't have to look directly into her eyes. They sat in silence for a while, watching the river, before Laura asked if the forest at Whitefield was like this one. This seemed like a good distraction for Ian, and he explained that the two forests were very similar. The trees in this forest were stunningly beautiful. It was just a pity they were birch trees. The girl didn't quite understand. She thought it was wonderful to have such a forest nearby, something you couldn't see in London. Ian countered that countless country folk dreamed of living in London. I mean, there are all sorts of fashionable things and opportunities, but with them come noise and exhaustion. Laura agreed, saying she was enjoying the tranquility here so much that she didn't even want to go back. The way she spoke, it sounded as if she were considering moving to Whitefield. Because honestly, the girl could immerse herself in that beautiful scenery every day, and then at the end of the day, she could stroll back to the manor and relax. Then walk into the forest again at the first light of dawn. If Miss Pennington wished, she could enjoy this view to her heart's content for as long as she wanted. Laura pondered for a moment, liking the idea of herself in that situation. Seeing her captivated look, Mr. Dalton invited her to Whitefield. Anytime she wanted to come, it was a very quiet place, and even the staff would be excited to have a new guest. Laura found the offer very thoughtful and promised she would find time to see the place for herself. But she explained that she would have to wait until Mr. Dalton had a mistress for the house. The man was taken aback for a moment, completely failing to understand what that had to do with anything. But Miss Pennington just couldn't bring herself to visit a bachelor's residence, so she asked him to resolve the matter as soon as possible, as she very much wanted to visit. I mean, she could see the beautiful scenery and the lovely Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, right? Hearing her say this, Ian felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't understand why Laura hadn't caught his hint. He unconsciously clenched his fists and only replied that he would do his best to speed up the process of finding a mistress for Whitefield. And one more thing, he would make sure that Mistress allowed Miss Pennington to stay in the house for as long as she wished. This remark sounded a bit harsh to Laura. Wives usually don't like their husbands mixing with other women. To this, Ian made a strange declaration, saying his wife would want Laura to stay by her side forever. Miss Pennington was taken aback, but she agreed that communication could make it possible. Even so, she couldn't imagine that situation ever happening. Unlike Ian, who bluntly declared that if he were to marry, Miss Pennington would become the mistress of Whitefield Manor. He said it as if it were non-negotiable, as if his wedding wouldn't happen without this prerequisite. This naturally left Laura speechless. She just stared at Ian, hoping for a more reasonable explanation. Mr. Dalton finally gathered his courage, deciding he needed to tell her something else. But the moment he opened his mouth, the girl suddenly stood up, but her posture looked different. With her back to him, she explained that his wife would never agree to such a thing, absolutely not. As if not wanting him to see the sadness on her face, Laura asked Ian to extend the invitation only as a friend. Then she took off running, despite Dalton's pleas for her to wait. But Miss Pennington was already dashing off in another direction, as if fleeing some kind of danger. Ian stood there, completely stunned, unable to believe he had just actually proposed, and in the most foolish way possible. And he immediately realized that Laura only saw him as a friend. It was an impulse, without thought, just a surrender to his feelings. Of course she would reject him, but Ian felt he had to do it. He had been staying in London, involuntarily imagining all of this in his mind. Dalton wanted to propose to Laura, plan a wedding, or at least an engagement, and then return to the manor with her. But his foolish move led to her rejecting him. So he decided to find Miss Pennington and explain everything. To him, it wasn't just an impulse, but a sincere confession, him opening his heart to her. Dalton now hoped Laura would reconsider what he had said and think about his proposal. However, when he reached the shore where the others were, they told him she had left for some urgent matter. Because she left in such a hurry, Dora had her coachman escort her. But then she grew curious. Since they had been together, why was Ian in such a rush to find Miss Pennington? Learning he had unfinished business, Dora explained that he wouldn't be able to speak with Laura for a long time, as she had declared she couldn't receive any guests for the time being due to a family matter. Apparently, a relative was coming to visit, but Mr. Dalton didn't hear the rest. The next day, he still showed up at the Pennington estate, and wouldn't let him in. They weren't receiving guests now, and the maid told the man to leave quickly. But Ian didn't give up. He asked the servant to at least pass a letter to Miss Pennington, but she flatly refused, saying she was under orders not to accept anything from visitors, and gave Ian a look of disgust. Dalton was prepared for rejection and decided to try his luck again later. But as he left, he kept looking up at the window of the girl's room, the girl he desperately wanted to see. The window was covered by curtains, and it wasn't until he was far away that Laura peeked out from behind them. She stood at the window a while longer, until the guest had completely disappeared from sight. But she couldn't talk to him now. From that day, a whole week passed, and Mr. Dalton grew restless, even starting to smoke. The whole situation was driving him mad. He kept trying to see Laura, but every time he visited, he was turned away. He couldn't even get past the front door, so he could only linger nearby. Ian couldn't shake the feeling that those doors were now closed to him forever. They couldn't go back to how things were, which angered him, but he believed there had to be a way. He heard a voice while deep in thought, but thought it was just his conscience calling to him. Then he opened his eyes and saw William, nearly jumping in fright. Fairfax had noticed something was off with his friend lately, though he kept denying it. William handed him a telegram, which Dalton found a bit strange. But he immediately started reading it, and its contents stunned him. Later, Ian returned to the Pennington estate, but as usual, and tried to send him away. The The man didn't intend to argue, but he asked her to pass something to Miss Pennington, saying it was urgent. He handed over a paper-wrapped object that looked a bit like a book. But the maid refused to take it, even when he explained it was an emergency. She told him that if Mr. Dalton wanted to send something to the young lady, he could do so by post. He would if he had time, but his train was leaving in 30 minutes, and he was in a hurry, and understood but was afraid of being fired. So Ian promised to find her a good job in Yorkshire. But the maid didn't like the countryside, so Dalton decided to bribe her with a few banknotes. The girl's expression changed, as if she had a soft spot for cash. Ian mentally chided himself for not doing this sooner and walked toward the gate with a hint of satisfaction. But stopped him and returned the money, and he thought it wasn't enough. But the maid wanted to ask him for a favor and promised to give the package to Laura if he agreed to return to London. The man didn't understand what that meant and demanded that he come back to win Miss Pennington's heart, that he must rush back from Yorkshire and fight for her love like a man. On his way, Mr. Dalton thought to himself that if he could, he would have done so long ago. Meanwhile, the maid brought the package to Laura, who was a bit surprised and asked what it was. It was then that, and admitted Mr. Dalton had come by again today. Miss Pennington was a little angry because she had told them not to accept anything from the man. But the maid swore he just thrust it at her and left, not giving her a chance to speak. Laura felt a bit frustrated with the man and decided to see what he wanted to give her. Inside was a letter in which Ian explained that, unfortunately, he had to leave London suddenly. Some unfortunate business forced him to return to Whitefield, where Reverend Genfield had passed away. As the landowner, he not only had to pay his respects, but also decide who would be the new reverend. As soon as he finished his business, Mr. Dalton intended to return to London. Things were not over between him and Miss Pennington, and he couldn't leave the city until he had won her back. Since the picnic, Ian had noticed Laura avoiding him, and he wanted to reassure her that he held no grudge. He just hoped they could go back to being friends, just like they were before. Once Dalton had handled his affairs, he would return to London, hoping for a chance to get closer to Miss Pennington. He also hoped she would give him a chance to explain. That was how the letter ended. Attached to the letter was a gift for Laura, a painting, which Ian greatly admired upon seeing it. Laura explained that Mr. Dalton had painted it. The painting depicted the gentleman's manner against a beautiful landscape, but Ian realized that with this gesture, the man was undoubtedly showing his hand. Miss Pennington asked the maid to hang the painting in the most prominent spot in the living room, and agreed, but she desperately wanted to know what was written in the letter that came with it. She kept thinking about it, as if it had something to do with her getting a raise or something. Seriously, the maid was really curious about what was going on between Mr. Dalton and Miss Pennington. Later that evening, Laura remained by the window, as if waiting for someone. She clutched the letter tightly, the letter that had suddenly become so precious to her. Then the maid came in, bringing her some water for washing up, as it was time for bed. But Miss Pennington asked her to wait a moment. She went to get ready, leaving the letter on the table, and realized her mistress had been reading it over and over, and was still dying of curiosity about the letter's contents, especially given the strange way Ian had delivered it. It could have been a love letter or a proposal, but she looked too dejected for that, and was dying of curiosity, especially since Laura wasn't one to gossip like other young ladies. As if hearing the maid's thoughts, Miss Pennington told her directly that Mr. Dalton intended to propose, and actually shrieked. She couldn't believe it was true. He had confessed his feelings in the letter, but his words weren't clear enough for Laura to be certain. Now the maid understood why her mistress had been pushing people away and acting so strangely lately. She couldn't believe Miss Pennington was avoiding a man who was about to propose, and even guessed that her mistress intended to refuse him. Laura sighed heavily, confirming she did not intend to accept Mr. Dalton's proposal. This was hard for the maid to accept, and though it wasn't her place, she suggested that avoidance wouldn't solve anything. Well, a lady could certainly refuse a proposal, but for Laura, it wasn't that simple. Someone like her couldn't just snub someone like Mr. Dalton. It would be a despicable act. The problem was she had no dowry, and to be honest, she was getting on in years for marriage, and didn't see it that way. She felt Mr. Dalton knew all this and was still devoted to her. But marriage was another matter entirely. Feelings alone weren't enough. You needed more to sustain it. The maid paused, then asked her mistress about her own feelings. and told her to cast aside all the other noise, look deep inside her heart, and figure out what she was really thinking. Miss Pennington was lost in thought. Then she stood up, as if not wanting to talk about it anymore, but then stopped in her tracks. She suddenly decided to confess why being a spinster was actually quite nice. That way, you could be friends with these young men without any strange feelings. Laura seemed at peace with this, but then she admitted she didn't have a single romantic feeling for Mr. Dalton. This stunned the maid, as she had been completely convinced of the opposite. But perhaps her mistress was just in denial and needed time to sort out her feelings, and didn't want to argue with her decision and just wished her good night, leaving her alone. Laura picked up the letter again. The handwriting was neat, elegant, and polite. Even after being snubbed, Mr. Dalton had sent her a letter and even a gift, which just went to show what a sincere and good person Ian was. But recalling his proposal on that rock and his somewhat strange request, the girl winced and the letter fell to the floor. As she picked it up, Laura couldn't understand his feelings, as she didn't see him that way at all, and she wished he felt the same, because she was completely unworthy of him and could not marry him. The only thing Miss Pennington could do now was hope that his return home would help him forget his feelings, and when he came back with a clear head, they could go back to being just friends. But Laura knew she was deceiving herself. Mr. Dalton's confession had actually upset her, and she had spent the whole week missing him. Her heart sank when Ian mentioned leaving, and then she read the line about him coming back countless times. This couldn't be just friendly affection. She hadn't felt this way in a long time. But it was a forbidden dream that could never come true, because her heart whispered that she would be hurt again. But then again, maybe it was enough that this man wanted her, and that they both genuinely liked each other. Miss Pennington reached for the locket around her neck, and childhood memories flooded back. Inside was a picture of her mother, whom she missed dearly, though she had never met her. One day, her grandmother saw her staring at the picture again and became very upset. Not long ago, the girl had seen her father, who told her not to cry, as they weren't saying goodbye forever. He promised to come back for her one day. She just had to be patient. He gave her this locket to wear always, in place of a necklace. That way, he and her mother would always be with her. This was her 7-year-old memory of parting with her father, who left her with the Penningtons. The separation from her beloved father left a painful wound in her heart, but her loving grandmother warmed her with her care. Abigail felt as if her deceased daughter had returned, and Laura's loneliness dissipated with her love. But it didn't last long. Laura's uncle, the family patriarch Gerald Pendleton, was not happy to see his niece. To him, she was just an embarrassing product of a scandal, and he was furious at his mother's decision to take her in. The constant arguments between mother and son took a toll on the little girl. Gerald would start a fight whenever he saw her, grabbing and throwing whatever was at hand, and even hitting her. So Laura learned to live in the shadows, hiding in corners like a mouse, and this went on for 3 years. Abigail's constant quarrels with her son ultimately led nowhere, and she was forced to concede. The old woman gave up on the idea of raising the child in the mansion and decided to send her to a boarding school. The Pendleton family was one of the most distinguished in England. From her first day at boarding school, Laura was followed by gossip, but she simply ignored it. The girl devoted herself to her studies, and with her hard work and natural intelligence, she became a top student. She also did everything she could to be the perfect model student, quiet, polite, and impeccable. She systematically erased and buried deep the shame of being Laura the illegitimate child, only to become Laura the scholar. A person perfect in every way. During her studies, Abigail fought to have her granddaughter officially added to the family tree, but the chances were slim. It wasn't until the old lady took extreme measures, promising to leave her fortune to Gerald's son, that things changed. Laura finally gained the right to use the Pennington surname, and after graduation, she could finally go home. But instead of the family estate, they took her to the townhouse in London. The old lady wanted her granddaughter to experience the high society life her mother never had, so she immediately introduced Laura to high society. But London had not forgotten the old scandal. It did not forgive, and it certainly did not accept Laura Pendleton. For 12 long years in society, Laura lived with the awareness that she was not a true aristocrat. But she learned to accept it with humility and without complaint, as it was the only way to survive the cold stares and sharp words. That's why Laura knew better than anyone what a decision based solely on feelings could lead to. Even if they loved each other, her origins would sooner or later become an obstacle. Then, all the pain she had endured would be passed on to their children. Mr. Dalton meant the world to Miss Pennington, but for that very reason, she had to refuse his proposal. Meanwhile, Mr. Dalton returned to his residence at Whitefield Manor from the funeral. The butler, Ramswick, was the first to greet him and asked how the funeral went. Although Ian had to immediately dive into a mountain of work upon his arrival, the funeral was peaceful, even with a large crowd, because Reverend Genfield was truly a good man. What bothered Mr. Dalton was that he couldn't be by his side in his final moments. He told Ramswick to send some people to clean Hartenham Cottage in the morning. Then Ian remembered he hadn't even asked how the butler was when he returned yesterday, so he asked about his health and if his knee was hurting more. But for the man, everything was normal. Mr. Dalton was glad to hear it and then apologized for being away for so long. Then the maid came in, wanting to greet him since he had returned so late yesterday that she had missed him. But it was no use, as he had already gone to his study. The butler noticed the maid looked a bit worried. She had really hoped Mr. Dalton would bring someone back from London, as he had never been away from the manor for so long, especially with the way he had been staring at her so intently. But it seemed the fellow wasn't about to reveal anything, and no one would know what had happened to him unless he wanted to say it himself. Back in his office, Mr. Dalton collapsed on the small sofa for a moment, lost in thought. He had been away for less than 2 months, but a mountain of things had already piled up on him. First, to sort out the rent and deal with those lawsuits. Then to get on good terms with the landowners and check on that mine that had just started excavation. And also to meet with a lawyer. But most importantly, to deal with the estate manager, as things had gotten completely out of hand. Now Dalton understood why Ramswick was in such a hurry to report everything as soon as he arrived at the manor. Not only was the guy lazy, but he had also started taking bribes, and we had to fire him immediately. He was recommended by Ian's brother-in-law, who, to be honest, had always been indifferent to his own family's business. But now Mr. Dalton had to clean up this mess. He had locked himself in his office for days, trying to get everything back on track, but now he finally felt like he was back in form. Ian could hardly believe he had spent a whole month in that noisy, chaotic place, but the memories were already fading quickly, with only one thing lingering in Mr. Dalton's mind. Only one image remained seared into his mind, impossible to forget. Ian began to wonder what Laura Pendleton was doing at that moment. He imagined she might be enjoying a lavish dinner at some wealthy family's home, or a splendid ball, dancing with some lucky nobody by her side. But on second thought, Ian felt that perhaps she, like him, was also standing by a window, gazing at the sky. Mr. Dalton had to admit that he really missed the girl and agonized over whether Miss Pendleton felt the same way about him. Although he knew the hope was slim, especially after she had rejected him so coldly last time. After that incident, it was impossible that she would want to see him again. Yes, but Mr. Dalton still felt that something was not right about the whole affair. For someone so sweet and gentle to suddenly become so cold to him, without even giving him a chance to explain, just as he was about to propose. Ian even began to wonder if Miss Pendleton despised him. Perhaps she was worried about the dowry issue and what others would think, which might explain her behavior. But he had plenty of money. She didn't need a dowry at all, and his reputation was already in tatters. So these couldn't be the real reasons for her rejection. This meant he had to try again. Dalton planned to go back to her and explain everything clearly, hoping Laura would listen seriously. She would listen calmly and carefully, with the serious expression and sharp mind that matched her character. After Mr. Dalton told her everything, he would once again sincerely ask her to be his wife. He imagined her in his mind, still shaking her head thoughtfully. He knew that a warm heart wouldn't stop Miss Pendleton from sticking to her position. No matter how he pleaded, even if he lost his temper, she might not even bat an eye. But no matter what, Mr. Dalton had no intention of backing down, because if he missed this chance, he would never feel this way again. He needed to find a decent housekeeper, then return to London, and he would not come back until she said yes. Ian desperately wanted to bring Miss Pendleton back to his estate, even if his actions were a bit excessive. Several days had passed since then, and the weather had been clear. But the butler noticed that his master had been behaving a bit strangely lately. Dalton had been lost in thought more and more frequently, as if his mind was elsewhere. From the looks of him, he probably wasn't sleeping well either. Ramswick brought him the documents regarding the pensions for retired servants. There was nothing wrong with the forms themselves, but the butler noticed that even when handling such matters, Ian was usually sharp and focused, yet now he seemed completely absent-minded. Something unknown must have happened in London. Suddenly, Ramsvick caught a glimpse of a sketch of a lady among the papers on the desk. He remained impassive, but began to understand his boss's reason for the unusual behavior. Then he left, but the other maids noticed his thoughtful and slightly surprised expression, and it wasn't just surprise. There was also a hint of a happy smile on his face, which was definitely a first. Meanwhile, Mr. Dalton was still endlessly sketching portraits of Miss Pendleton, her image seared into his mind. Ian put down his pen, thinking that since things were in order, it was time to go see his sister, who had been waiting for him. Afterwards, as he was preparing to leave, Ian confessed to Ramsvick that he would have to return to London soon. He didn't know how long he would be there this time, but it might be longer than the last. He also tasked Ramsvick with finding a decent housekeeper, suggesting he could even place an ad in the newspaper. Mr. Dalton walked towards the main gate, but the butler was now worried for another reason, realizing it was all related to the woman in the portrait. Ever since his master returned, he had been restless, and the only explanation was that he was deeply in love. But this made the butler very happy, because not only would Mr. Dalton find his own happiness, but he would also bring a mistress to the house. Ian set off for Danvers Park, which he hadn't visited in over a month, hoping everything was well there. Judging by the time, Mr. Dalton's brother-in-law was likely out hunting. Suddenly, he heard the sound of children arguing. It was Ian's nephews squabbling over a toy because one wouldn't let the other play with it. Just as they were bickering, their uncle appeared, and the little ones immediately stopped their childish squabble. The children were a little surprised that Mr. Dalton was back from London, and one of them hid the toy behind his back. Ian said nothing to the children, simply dismounting his horse and walking towards them. Then he held out his hand, demanding they hand over what they had been fighting about. Daniel explained that it was just a wooden gun and they were playing a hunting game. But Uncle Ian wasn't buying it and demanded for the last time that they hand it over. The fierce look on his face forced the boys to obey, and although Daniel was very reluctant, he handed over the toy. At that moment, Mr. Dalton's sister was sitting alone in her room. She was fiddling with cards on the table, trying to get a glimpse of the future. The door was suddenly pushed open, and Ian spoke first. "What's with the sudden fortune-telling tricks?" Margaret Fairfax was clearly startled. "Ian, when did you get back?" she asked. Dalton walked in without a word and then slammed what he had taken from the children onto the table. Seeing his furious face, Margaret was stunned. "Is this a real revolver?" Ian demanded to know why his nephews were playing shooting games, but then realized his sister already knew. Apparently, the children had stolen it from their father. Dalton told her to give the gun back to her husband and tell him to lock up his damn gun. His sister agreed, but begged him not to punish the children by making them clean the stables, saying they would stink for days. Then she tried to distract him with the cards, even though he was thinking, "What the hell? They were playing with a loaded gun, and if I hadn't found out, something terrible could have happened." Margaret still didn't understand why Ian was so agitated. Nothing bad happened, did it? Then she returned to her cards, completely convinced that her brother had met someone in London. She laid out 3 cards in front of her and predicted that he would be married by the end of the year. Now she was dying to know who the lucky lady was, but Ian insisted it was a misunderstanding and that he wasn't seeing anyone. Then Margaret confessed that William had told her everything, including how popular Ian was in London. But what surprised her was that he was so friendly to everyone there, even attending tea parties with the ladies. But Ian dismissed it, saying only that he was responding to invitations, even though he never used to do so. His sister guessed the real reason was a certain woman who had caught his eye and who had also attended all those parties. Margaret even guessed it was the Miss Pendleton he had mentioned in his letter, the girl he had danced with. Knowing his sister wouldn't stop her interrogation, Mr. Dalton decided to return to his own estate. But suddenly, Margaret screamed and clutched her chest as if she had been stabbed by something in excruciating pain. Then her head lolled to the side, and Ian was terrified, thinking something had happened to his sister. He was about to call for a doctor, but the girl immediately snapped her head up and then stuck out her tongue, teasing her brother like a child. Mr. Dalton was genuinely angry, but Margaret grabbed him by the collar and demanded he confess. She could feel that even the air around Ian had changed, because you can always tell when a man has lost his heart to a specific woman. The Miss Pendleton in Margaret's imagination was a very smart and beautiful girl, about 22 years old. Then she let go of her brother, but ordered him to confess immediately. His dazed and lost look also gave him away, like someone who had fallen in love, but was not reciprocated. Then Margaret suddenly understood. Her brother had fallen into the trap of unrequited love. Now she understood why Ian looked so haggard. It was all because a lonely heart could not win the lady's affection. Dalton repeatedly swore that he and the lady were just good friends, but Margaret didn't believe him at all. But if that were true, then she had every right to send the woman a deeply moving letter Ian had written in his childhood. Yes, the very letter Dalton had brought to her, sniffling, on the eve of his sister's wedding. The letter said that even if Margaret got married and moved far away, Ian would still love her forever. What's more, the letter was written in crooked handwriting, full of spelling mistakes, and stained with his tears. Margaret had cried when she read it, but now she just found it amusing, while Ian was furious. It was a precious memory, and Margaret thought that if she sent the letter to William, he would surely show it to the girl. Dalton knew his sister was probably seriously considering it. It was a form of torture for her. Even though she said in a joking tone that she would never hurt him, she was just curious. But Ian still decided to tell his sister a little about him and Miss Pendleton, and so she understood. Laura would not reciprocate his feelings, but suggested they be friends for now. He shouldn't push too hard, and should give the lady time to get used to his presence. Meanwhile, Ian must calm down and act more casually towards other young women. He needed to pretend to be pursuing others so that Miss Pendleton would let her guard down. Then after a while, Dalton needed to make his move, but very carefully. Once her walls began to crumble, her true feelings would naturally emerge. But Ian still had to pretend to give his heart to someone else and ask Laura for love advice, because then the budding, unconscious jealousy would force Miss Pendleton to face the truth, even though she desperately wanted to ignore it. By then, she would become a victim of painful longing. Margaret thought the plan was solid, but Ian felt the whole spiel was utter nonsense. His sister wanted to teach him the art of seduction, but he didn't understand playing with a woman's feelings like that. Then Mr. Dalton prepared to leave, as he had only come to check on his sister's health. Suddenly, Margaret told him to stay, but he left anyway. It finally dawned on her. Did her brother just call Miss Pendleton his woman? But now she was quite certain that this love story would bring a new mistress to Whitefield. Meanwhile, in London at the estate of Baron Lance, Dora had invited one of her friends for tea. That was how she learned that Mr. Dalton had urgent business in Whitefield and had left London in a hurry. The guest, Janet Fairfax, couldn't believe she was having tea alone with Lady Lance. Everyone said she was the socialite of the season, and now she saw for herself how elegant she was. In fact, a short while ago, Dora had been furious when she received a reply from Mr. Fairfax. The man wrote that he had received the invitation, but the addressee was in Whitefield and could not attend her grand party. That was how Dora learned that Mr. Dalton had left without saying goodbye. Now, Dora hoped to get some information from William's sister, asking her if Mr. Dalton intended to return. But Janet wasn't sure, as he hated the city and hadn't shown up for 5 years before this. However, Mr. Dalton hadn't explained anything before he left, so this was just Miss Fairfax's speculation. But Lady Lance still believed that the gentleman would return to London soon. But the days passed in silence, with no news of him. Dora wanted to send him a letter to Whitefield herself, but her relationship with Mr. Dalton wasn't that close. Just then, as she was chatting with Janet, William joined them. Lady Lance was delighted to see him, explaining that tea had just finished and dinner would be served shortly. William thanked them for the invitation and also thanked Dora for her recent care of his sister Janet. Dora said she was happy to grow closer to their family and was glad they could all enjoy a simple dinner together. All that was left was to head to the dining room, and William, being a gentleman, offered Dora his arm. To her, this lady was his only connection to Mr. Dalton, so she needed to stay on good terms with them, as it was a chance to find out about Ian, or at least to remind him of her existence. Besides, William Fairfax was a great conversationalist, and Dora even enjoyed talking with him during dinner. Lady Lance also invited Janet to the theater with her next week. Meanwhile, Miss Pendleton was sorting through the mail and found letters for her grandmother and an invitation for tea with Baron Lewis. But then, she saw a letter with a signature that sent a chill down her spine. The letter was from her uncle, Gerald Pendleton, which could not be good, especially since it was addressed not to her grandmother, but specifically to Laura. The man hadn't been heard from in years, not even a basic greeting. The letter itself was devoid of courtesy, and its content was as blunt and harsh as Gerald himself. Laura remembered his cold, emotionless tone and his extreme stinginess with words. From the letter, Laura learned that while her uncle and his second son, Charles, were in America, they met a man named Tom Price, with whom Gerald had been friends at university. Thanks to this gentleman, his goddaughter, Joan Jensen, and Charles were now engaged. Now Price was coming to London for his sister's silver wedding anniversary. The name Tom Price sounded familiar to Laura, and she recalled that this man had recently caused quite a stir in society. On the surface, he was just an unremarkable, gray-haired man, understated but completely self-assured. But beneath that calm exterior was a prominent figure in the American financial world. London society had embraced him. There were even rumors that he was originally English, had gone to America as a child, and married a beautiful wife there. They had children, but then his wife passed away, and now, 30 years later, he had returned to his homeland. His sudden appearance became a source of all sorts of wild gossip and speculation among the upper class. Price often appeared at social events, and for a particular reason. Apparently, he was looking for a lady to fill the empty space by his side. This rumor spread like wildfire through London, and everyone had heard Tom Price. From the letter's content, Laura knew she was expected to show great hospitality to Price before Gerald and Charles arrived. The thought of her uncle coming to London soon was driving her mad. She tried to remain calm, because she was no longer the terrified 7-year-old girl. The girl who used to tremble and hide at the mere sight of that man. The fear was still inside her, but if she could handle this, her uncle wouldn't be angry with her again. The only thing the girl didn't know was what her grandmother would say. Even if she could accept it herself, it would be a difficult year for the old lady, and the last thing she needed now was stress. Laura needed to handle it just right so as not to give her any reason to worry. Most importantly, she had to surround her grandmother with care so that she could finally find some peace and tranquility. Hearing such news, Abigail might get angry or even faint from shock. Later, Laura met with her grandmother and carefully told her about Gerald's upcoming visit with his friend. She was ready to step in and help the moment the old lady started to get anxious. But Abigail held steady and even asked her granddaughter to prepare the guest rooms. We must also send an invitation to Mr. Price, as he is a friend of the family and deserves a warm welcome. The girl was somewhat shocked. She never expected her grandmother to react this way. Seeing her granddaughter's confused look, Abigail asked her to come closer. The old lady knew that Laura didn't want to host Gerald, who had caused her so much suffering. The girl tried to argue, saying he was the head of the Pendleton family, and she was just stressed about the preparations. Abigail took Laura's hand, took a deep breath, and then said something important. Then she asked her to endure it for a few days for her sake. Laura agreed and ordered the servants, Jim and Harry, to prepare the 2 largest rooms on the 2nd floor, and a smaller one, and to move furniture if necessary. Once the bouquets and the vases were ready, we must decorate the living room and fill the shelves with them. While giving orders, Miss Pendleton kept thinking about her grandmother, who might not even make it through the year, and who wanted to reconcile with her son before it was too late. That was why she had asked Laura to hold on and prepare everything perfectly. Laura didn't want her grandmother to explain anything. She had been a mother to her after she became an orphan. Now, the girl promised to show those gentlemen how well Abigail had raised her. By evening, Laura was exhausted, barely having the strength to climb into bed. But she had worked hard today. Tomorrow she just needed to finish the cleaning and finalize the menu with the cook. The roof repairs had to be done before the guests arrived, and then everything should go smoothly. Before falling asleep, Laura thought of her grandmother, who had fought against her family and supported her for her granddaughter's happiness. So the girl should be grateful to Abigail for sacrificing everything she had given. But in truth, Laura had never felt happy in that house. As she fell asleep, she remembered lying on her father's lap on the train. In her memory, the artist was a man who never had any peace. The girl clearly remembered the last time she saw his face. He had abandoned her then to travel the world, as raising a daughter was too much of a burden for him. The man had finally made his choice. In a moment of real heartache, Laura couldn't help but wonder what her life would have been like if they had stayed together. Perhaps she wouldn't have gained the knowledge she got from her grandmother. Perhaps she wouldn't have had the chance to live in such a respectable environment, but maybe a life of struggle would have made her a little happier. Now Laura had a grandmother who had even sacrificed her own son for her granddaughter. Abigail lived almost for Laura, and Laura did everything she could to thank her. The girl took the place of her daughter, showing her what a true lady could be, becoming her pride and joy. Yet in society, she had to be constantly on guard, even smiling at those who despised her. Laura had to live as Miss Pendleton, and she wondered what it would be like to just be Laura. But she knew very well that when her grandmother passed away, she could not stay in the Pendleton house. Everyone would gossip about the humiliating downfall of a penniless aristocratic lady. However, that day could also be the beginning of a new life for Laura, where she could finally live like an ordinary person. And the closer that sad farewell came, the clearer the day of the new beginning became. For his sake, and for her grandmother's, Laura had to stay with her through the difficult days, take care of her, and endure her troublesome son, so that she could pass away in peace. Only then, when she was finally alone, could Laura truly begin to live her own life. After some time, the day of the dinner party arrived, and Miss Pendleton had also invited Miss Hyde. She was happy to see her friend, as they hadn't seen each other in a long time. She was also curious to hear that Laura's new suitor would be coming. Jane also said that she really liked her job, and although it had only been 2 weeks, they already trusted her with simple tasks, which she was doing excellently. Just as the girls were chatting, Tom Price approached and greeted them in a low baritone voice. Laura spoke first, introducing herself as Gerald's niece, and then introduced her friend. Tom was pleased to meet her, and when he noticed Jane's attire, they explained that she was a typist. He even asked her directly if she wanted to get married. The man didn't miss an opportunity, but she turned him down, saying she wanted to avoid marriage, which was why she had chosen the path of a professional woman. At this, Mr. Price cryptically mentioned that Miss Hyde had revealed an important secret, that a husband is merely a burden to a woman, a burden that even his late wife had rid herself of. Then, they heard a carriage approaching. The other guests had apparently arrived, and it was time to prepare for dinner. As Miss Pendleton had expected, the dinner was a great success. Mr. Price, who had lived in America for 30 years, was in his element as an eloquent storyteller, especially when he recounted anecdotes of New York high society, filled with irony, observation, and sharp wit. At times his voice would become inappropriately loud, but his topics always hovered on the edge of acceptability, and because he was so self-assured, even his most explicit comments didn't embarrass the guests in the slightest. Therefore, dinner parties with him in attendance were considered the liveliest around. As the evening drew to a close, Mr. Price sincerely thanked Miss Pendleton for a perfect dinner party. He had truly had a very pleasant time that evening. He also mentioned that he had heard Laura performed excellently every time, which had left a deep impression on him. That night, the girl collapsed in a bed, pleased with Mr. Price's satisfaction, as it meant her uncle would have no complaints. She had been a little worried before, but now she felt Mr. Price was a good man. She was happy that the dinner had gone smoothly. Sometimes this kind of work truly exhausted her, just like now, but in these chaotic times, being busy allowed her to temporarily forget about Ian. Some time passed, and at the 5th dinner party held for Mr. Price, something unusual happened. That night, everyone else left early, and they helped Mrs. Abigail Pendleton upstairs to rest. Mr. Price asked Laura to play the piano, and so the two of them were left alone in the drawing room. Suddenly, she had a strange feeling, as if the 4 walls were closing in on her. Tom confessed that he had heard about Miss Pendleton as soon as he arrived in London. Her uncle had told him that she was the very model of English restraint and grace. Laura found it strange that her uncle would praise her so, especially since he hadn't visited her since she was 10. But then she heard footsteps, and, turning around, she found Mr. Price right in front of her. He startled her, and she let out a cry. A maid heard the sound and rushed in, worried something was wrong. But she saw Mr. Price kneeling on one knee before Laura, holding her hand. Miss Pendleton turned to the maid, said everything was fine, and told her to go back to her duties. Once they were alone again, Tom pleaded with Laura not to be alarmed and to hear him out. He confessed that meeting Gerald had awakened something deep inside him that he had long forgotten. It was a sense of homesickness, especially a longing for English women, whose grace and taste he believed were unmatched in the world. Tom had hoped that among the women he met, he would find one who could remind him of his late wife. One evening, he realized he had already met her, the woman he wanted to spend the rest of his life with, Miss Pendleton. He saw in her the shadow of the woman he had lost, and now he was asking her to marry him. She would return with him to America and start a new life there. The age difference didn't frighten Tom. He saw not a young girl, but an intelligent woman capable of filling the void in his heart. Now, he hoped Miss Pendleton would agree to be his wife. The girl was completely stunned, but she understood his intentions and, without hesitation, flatly refused him. She did not love him and felt it would be impossible to love him in the future. Price was clearly dejected, but Laura asked him not to be angry and hoped he would accept the rejection with dignity. After that, Mr. Price no longer came to the Pendleton estate for dinner, but he was a very persistent man. Starting the very next day, he began sending flowers to the Pendleton home, and after finding out Laura's schedule through mutual friends, he started appearing at every ball and concert she attended. She constantly refused him and sent the flowers back, but this did nothing to deter Tom. The same scenario played out over and over until Miss Pendleton was essentially forced to give up her social life. Laura didn't want to see him, and rumors that he was pursuing her spread like wildfire through their social circle. Most people thought it was a godsend for Laura, and some even considered it her last chance to marry. She was almost 30, and high society couldn't understand why she was resisting. Laura should have been thrilled that a kind and wealthy man had taken notice of her. Everyone had their own opinion, but deep down, they were all worried about something else. No one wanted this to happen to their own daughter. This fear spread like wildfire through every family with an unmarried girl, and Miss Pendleton became a cautionary tale, a true negative example in society. But Dora Lenz thought people were making a mountain out of a molehill. She just couldn't imagine Laura with Price. I mean, Miss Pendleton from the Earl's family, it would be nothing short of scandal. Although Dora's mother thought she was too naive, and even her friends disagreed with her, she complained to William, saying the whole thing was so unfair to Miss Pendleton, especially since the man was so much older than her, which would only make Laura feel more humiliated. Dora couldn't understand why Gerald wouldn't prepare a dowry for his niece. Honestly, we shouldn't meddle in other people's family affairs, but the girl felt it was just too cruel. With a dowry, Laura could marry a man closer to her own age, even if he wasn't some nobleman. William also thought it was ridiculous that people judged Miss Pendleton solely on her origins. If it weren't for the issue of her family background, she might have had a decent dowry. But now everyone was pointing fingers, as if Laura could choose her own parents. Just then, William interrupted Miss Lenz, pointing out that they were the ones being nosy and meddling in Miss Pendleton's affairs. The girl admitted she had gotten a bit carried away, but she hadn't meant to speak ill of Laura. They both understood that Miss Pendleton was going through a difficult time, but she was strong enough to handle it on her own. On the way back, Dora knew she had to be more careful, especially since William would be sending a message to Mr. Dalton. If he said anything bad about her, she would be finished. William was eager to know when Ian would return, so he decided to send him a message. After all, Ian did ask him to keep him informed of Laura's situation. Getting news lately had been troublesome, and now things were becoming too personal. So William decided to mention that the Earl's friends in London were still in contact with the family. He gave the letter to the butler, Mason, but immediately after, another letter was delivered. This letter was from his sister-in-law, and Mr. Fairfax immediately began to read it. Afterwards, he decided to rewrite his letter because his sister had already found out that Miss Pendleton had a suitor. She begged him not to tell Ian the news, because the girl had truly captured Ian's heart. Margaret asked him to tell her everything about the lady, since William had taken it upon himself to find a partner for Ian. Fairfax regretted not realizing sooner that Dalton, who hated high society, was practically living at the Pendletons. He hastily wrote another letter and told the butler to send it by express post immediately. Shortly after, Ian Dalton received the express letter, which clearly threw him into a state of turmoil. A few days later, he appeared at the Fairfax estate, and the butler was completely stunned to see him. Dalton only wanted to know where William was and told them to take his luggage to a guest room. The servants immediately sprang into action, still not understanding why he had come. But they did notice that despite his efforts to appear calm, he looked anxious. When Ian burst in and started interrogating him about who a certain man was, William nearly choked on his tea. At first, Fairfax was completely bewildered, asking Ian why he had shown up so suddenly. But Dalton cared about nothing at that moment, except finding out who that fellow was. He demanded to know the name of that American upstart, his tone becoming sharp and loud. William guessed that Dalton had received the telegram and asked him what he planned to do about the man. Dalton didn't want to get too dirty. He just wanted to send him back across the ocean and make sure he never returned. Judging by the fury building in Ian's mind, William guessed he was going to challenge Price to a duel. He immediately tried to dissuade his friend, saying it was complete madness. I mean, that sort of barbaric nonsense went out of fashion when their grandfathers were still alive. But that didn't stop Dalton, especially since the law didn't forbid it. Dueling was perfectly legal. So he had a chance to put a hole in that scoundrel's forehead, and it would be completely by the book. Ian warned William that if he wanted to stop him, he had to send that old man back to America immediately. Fairfax was still trying to correct Ian's thinking, while also asking if he was truly in love with Laura. But, hey, if it weren't for that, Mr. Dalton wouldn't be standing here now with such intentions. Ian admitted that ever since they first met, he hadn't been able to get the girl out of his mind. If everything had gone according to plan, he wouldn't have had to leave midway and return to Whitefield. Dalton wanted to marry her and take her home with him. William realized Miss Pendleton knew of Ian's feelings, but he was very surprised to hear she had rejected him. What he found even stranger was that after being rejected, Dalton was threatening to shoot her uncle's friend. This didn't seem like love, more like reckless jealousy, and Ian might do something foolish. But he didn't back down. He was certain that if Laura had a brother or a father, they would also challenge Price to a duel to defend her honor. So now Ian was going to teach that old fellow a lesson for daring to approach Miss Pendleton. Seeing Dalton starting to lose control, William tried to calm him down. He asked him if he had considered whether he had any right to do so. I mean, Ian and Laura had no relationship, so he couldn't just threaten her guest with a gun for the sake of her honor. If he actually did that, the girl would probably never want to see him again. If Dalton wanted to win her heart, he needed to calm down and think things through. William promised to help him, but first, he told him to put that damn gun away. Fairfax was stunned. He never thought his friend would do something like this, even in a fit of passion. He also realized that Ian and Laura were actually a well-matched pair. They would be good for each other. Miss Pendleton could handle Dalton's strong personality and become his faithful lifelong partner. But she had refused him, so William asked Ian exactly how he had proposed. After Dalton explained what happened, William felt he had never seen a bigger fool in his life. But now he understood. This was why Miss Pendleton always avoided talking about Ian. Fairfax said the first step was to win back her trust and become her friend again, so that Dalton might have a chance. Ian agreed, but he still planned to get rid of the old man, if not with a gun, then by some other means. Seeing his friend still didn't get it, William told him to listen again. He had known Miss Pendleton for 6 years, and many scoundrels had tried to take advantage of her vulnerability. She was a woman alone, without a father to protect her, which made her prey for many men. But she had never wavered, and she was perfectly capable of handling this situation on her own. If Dalton interfered now, he would only ruin things between him and Miss Pendleton. He had a chance to be her friend now, so he shouldn't go and cause trouble with Price. Because after that, the girl would never want to see or hear from him again, and Dalton could say goodbye to his dream of marrying the lady. So, he needed to stay calm now and not let his anger get the better of him. Ian knew his friend was right, even though he wanted to beat that scoundrel to a pulp and throw him out of England. After that, Dalton would take revenge on anyone who dared to harm Miss Pendleton. And the fact that William was right drove him crazy, because Laura really would want nothing to do with him ever again. He just wanted to catch a glimpse of her and started thinking about how to suddenly let her know he was in London. As he was thinking, Janet came in and announced that Miss Dora Lenz had heard of his arrival and had come to visit. William had probably let slip. However, Dalton asked in confusion, who on earth was Miss Lenz? The girl was stunned, not understanding how Ian could forget Dora Lenz, the most beautiful of the nobility. The name sounded vaguely familiar to him, and the man began to rack his brain, remembering that Laura had introduced him to someone named Lenz. Now he couldn't remember why this girl would want to see him, as their conversation had been nothing earth-shattering. Dalton claimed he was dead tired and told Janet to send the guest away, saying he wasn't home. But the girl had already let it slip that he was here, though Ian couldn't care less. It had occurred to him that Pendleton was pleased when he was kind to her friends. So he agreed to see Miss Lenz, who was ecstatic to see him. He acted the gentleman and apologized for his long silence. While Dora confessed, she had a ton of questions. William was also present, surprised that Ian had agreed to come out so quickly. Dora then began to chat about how things were at his estate and what the weather was like there. At first, Dalton gave short, polite answers to what he considered silly questions. He regretted agreeing to the meeting when her incessant chatter began to grate on his nerves. The girl talked nonstop, giggling at everything, even the most basic trifles. Her sweetness was clearly an act, but she played it well, which made Ian want to choke on his own smoke. The girl suddenly announced that Mr. Dalton had returned at just the right time. It was the height of the ball season, and the boat races were about to begin, but Ian had no interest in that sport. He would rather read a book or continue living his incredibly boring life. Then Janet remembered that Mr. Dalton was a wonderful artist, the kind that would make other artists jealous. Dora begged Ian to let her see his drawings, even just for a quick glance. Janet also began to pester him, but Mr. Dalton wouldn't budge. But he knew he wouldn't get away that easily, and soon, the girls were flipping through his sketchbook, exclaiming in amazement. His drawings were true works of art that any professional would go crazy for. Perfect works, every stroke filled with keen observation and skill. A minute later, Dora gave Mr. Dalton a sly look and asked him to draw a portrait of her. The man, who had been hoping she would finally leave, nearly choked on his tea at the request. He began to gasp and make excuses, saying he wasn't good at faces and didn't want to draw her unattractively. Miss Lenz persisted, promising they wouldn't tell anyone if it turned out badly. Ian still argued that it was improper to paint a portrait of an unmarried lady who had been presented at court. He said it was a matter of her reputation, sounding as if he were worried about her good name. Dora was briefly dejected, but found a loophole, asking him to draw her with Janet. At this point, William chimed in, understanding completely, and explained that if they were both in the picture, Laura wouldn't misunderstand. Mr. Dalton realized he was cornered, so he decided to play along, as this eccentric girl was his only link to Miss Pendleton now. He decided to take the chance and asked her to fetch some pencils. Miss Lenz was thrilled, promising to later hang the drawing in the most prominent spot in her drawing room, so that every guest could see what a skilled artist Mr. Dalton was. Ian told the girls to hold still and began to sketch delicately on the paper. Later, on the way back, Dora couldn't stop admiring the exquisite and elegant portrait. Ian had intended to do a quick job, but he ended up drawing the girls beautifully. Now Dora understood that he possessed not only wealth, but also true artistic talent. As he drew them, Miss Lenz felt as if his gaze captured every part of her soul. To her, the whole thing was incredibly romantic. Back home, she chose the most ornate frame and hung the portrait right in the center of the drawing room. Before long, the portrait began to give Dora a charming, if somewhat false, feeling. The next day, on Grosvenor Street, a maid spotted a man lurking outside and immediately rushed towards him, nearly knocking over another maid carrying a laundry basket. Once outside, and said it was so romantic to be loitering at his sweetheart's door so early in the morning. She knew, of course, that it was Mr. Dalton, though he tried to hide his identity with a hat and a long coat. Meanwhile, Miss Pendleton needed but she was nowhere to be found. Ian began to ask the maid how Laura had been while he was away, and admitted something was wrong, but it had nothing to do with the mistress's health. Dalton realized they were talking about the American upstart. After getting the old man's name from the maid, Ian started asking where the fellow lived, and knew this information, but was afraid to tell Mr. Dalton, as she could guess his reaction. It was written all over his face that he would smash the man's face in the moment he saw him, and didn't mind someone teaching the old man a lesson, but she didn't want the master to do it himself, because he was supposed to marry Miss Laura, and didn't want her to marry a murderer. Ian sensed the maid was trying to help him, so he asked for her opinion on whether he had a chance to win Miss Pendleton's heart. Of course there was a chance, as long as he didn't go and shoot Mr. Price. If he decided to challenge the old fellow to a duel, Laura would undoubtedly cut ties with him forever. Moreover, Gerald Pendleton wouldn't let it go, since he had arranged the marriage in the first place, which meant Laura could end up dead at her uncle's hands or be banished from England forever. But Ian was convinced there was a way out. Laura just needed to ditch the old fellow and agree to live with him, especially since she had nothing to lose. She wouldn't get any inheritance anyway. Besides, once Abigail passed away, Miss Pendleton would have nowhere to go and be completely finished. Just then, and dropped a bombshell, her mistress was planning to become a governess. The news stunned Ian, who thought it was complete madness. I mean, no family would hire a noble lady as a servant. They were all considered spoiled and pampered. But Laura was different. She even knew Greek and Latin, and was sure they would hire her without hesitation. After all, a governess fluent in 5 languages was rarer than hen's teeth. Miss Pendleton was strong-willed and had immense pride. If all went well, she could make a very good life for herself. But that also meant she might run off to a place where Dalton could never find her. Laura would no longer need him, so he had to act fast. As he said goodbye to, and Ian told her not to tell Laura he had been there. The maid guessed he was up to something, but she promised to keep her mouth shut, and returned to the house where her mistress was waiting for her, saying she had gone out to check on the candlesticks. Laura found this odd, as Harry had just delivered them yesterday, but asked the maid to help her pick a tablecloth anyway. In any case, Laura was also annoyed that the repairman hadn't come to fix the stairs yet. Listening to her chatter, the maid realized Laura had no suspicion of her meeting with Mr. Dalton, and had always thought the man was a true gentleman, elegant and restrained, but today there was something in his eyes, a dangerous focus, a real stubbornness. The worst part was that the searing gaze was directed at her mistress. But then, and realized that this was exactly what Laura needed, and this man would not back down. The maid herself hoped he would marry Miss Pendleton and take her to his estate to start a new life. Meanwhile, with the portrait hanging in the drawing room, rumors about Mr. Dalton began to fly. The fact that he had painted a portrait for a lady and given it to her was enough to start gossip. Except there was another lady in the picture, which threw a wrench in the gossip machine. So at the Lynn's estate, after an elegant tea party, the ladies began to dissect Mr. Dalton. They praised him lavishly, recalling his words and how he had completely agreed with Dora. This could mean his heart belonged to her, a sign that he had fallen in love. The girls found him both considerate and gentle and hoped to see him again to get to know him better. One girl even thought Miss Lynn's might be waiting for the man to propose. But Dora knew his return to London was no accident. He probably had his own purpose. Judging by the portrait he painted, that purpose might just be her. She told her friends to keep his secret, as she didn't know his true feelings. But they wouldn't let it go and began to fantasize about a wedding at the Whitefield estate. Then they wondered what Whitefield was like. They had never even seen a picture of the place. The Daltons probably don't want to show off the manor. I mean, it's a family sanctuary, and in their eyes, it shouldn't be public information for everyone to gawk at. They don't even let tourists in, but one of the ladies confessed that a picture of the manor was recently seen. They also said the painting hangs in the drawing room of the Pendleton family manor. It was then that Laura came back to look at the painting again. A friend of one of the gossipy girls had recently come for tea and noticed the landscape painting on the drawing room wall. Miss Pendleton herself told the girl that the painting was of Whitefield Manor. But the girls were curious how the painting ended up in the Pendleton home, and they also found out that Mr. Dalton used to frequent the place. Dora's friends began to suspect he was becoming quite close with the Pendletons. You see, he gave them a painting of the manor, yet he never mentioned a word about the place to Dora. Miss Lance was quite frustrated at the time. She was dying to know even a little something about Whitefield Manor. But what shocked her more was that Miss Pendleton and Mr. Dalton were close friends. She overheard her friends whispering that they had already pictured her as the mistress of the manor, so she had nothing to lose. I mean, Mr. Dalton painted her portrait, which was something she could boast about in itself. And Dora, she was swept up in the trend and didn't even realize she had lost her senses. A few days later, Sir Gerald Pendleton arrived at the townhouse with his party. Laura naturally went out to greet him, but felt a lump in her throat, unable to breathe. For the first time in years, she was face to face with this man again. First, Laura saw Charles, who looked exactly like his uncle back in the day. Then she noticed he wasn't in a hurry to come in, but instead offered his hand to someone. A lady stepped out of the carriage, looking a bit haughty at first. She couldn't believe she was seeing the townhouse. It was Joan Jensen, and she could immediately tell that the place exuded taste and refinement in every detail. As the heiress to an American tycoon, she radiated confidence and a fatal charm. It was then that Miss Pendleton felt a chill run down her spine. She saw her Uncle Gerald, his face as grim as ever. The girl knew she had to remain calm and not panic. She was no longer that naive child, and Gerald was no longer the reckless, impulsive young heir. Now, this house was hers, and they were merely guests, and she greeted them politely. She added that she was welcoming them on behalf of the homeowner, Mrs. Abigail Pendleton. Laura promised to ensure their stay was comfortable. She spoke courteously during their stay, but the men still looked displeased. However, Joan Jensen greeted her warmly and offered her hand to Miss Pendleton. She also gave her a sweet smile and said she was delighted to meet her. Laura was taken aback. The lady had greeted her directly without even waiting for an introduction. Nevertheless, she extended her hand and stated her full name. Joan admitted she couldn't wait to come here, as she had heard the townhouse was the best in all of London. Laura agreed and offered to give her a tour if she liked. Miss Jensen loved the idea, and what's more, she quite liked Miss Pendleton herself. She immediately asked her for a pot of tea. Miss Jensen was so engrossed that she seemed to have completely forgotten about her fiancé, Charles. He reminded her that they didn't plan to stay long, especially since Mr. Price was waiting for them. But Joan felt it wouldn't hurt to stay a little longer. Her godfather wouldn't die just because they saw him a bit later. Charles clearly disagreed, believing he had every right to decide what was best for his fiancée. He grabbed her hand, declaring that in England, it was tradition for a bride to obey her future husband. Joan wanted to ask Laura if this tradition was true, but Laura didn't quite agree. Just then, Miss Jensen shook off his hand, but Gerald began urging her to go to Mr. Price's as soon as possible. Not wanting to make a scene, his future daughter-in-law compromised, but she promised to return in the evening with her godfather for dinner. Afterward, they said their goodbyes. Miss Pendleton knew she would have to see the obnoxious face of that clingy fiancé again. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice that sounded like it came from a cellar, asking if the rooms were ready. Of course, it was her uncle. The girl politely explained that everything on the third floor was ready. Gerald and Charles were staying, and Miss Pendleton promised a servant would show him to his room. The men went inside, but Laura could feel their hateful gazes burning her back. Nevertheless, she decided to block out the negativity and ignore them. Her mission was to make tonight's dinner the most perfect reception in Pendleton family history. A little later, Laura learned from the servant, Leon, that the two men had gone upstairs to greet the mistress of the house. On the surface, it was no big deal, but Miss Pendleton became unusually anxious. The girl couldn't imagine what would happen after they had been at odds for so many years. In her mind, they would immediately break into an all-out argument, and if Grandma Abigail got too agitated, her condition could worsen significantly. Miss Pendleton wanted to prevent the impending disaster, so she also headed towards the old woman's bedroom. Her intention was to try and reconcile them, and she carefully peeked through the crack in the door. She was stunned when she saw Gerald kneeling by the bed, begging his mother for forgiveness. Abigail calmly told him not to worry about it. What shocked Laura was seeing the scoundrel who had tormented her shed real tears. To figure out what was going on, she entered the room, but Charles didn't seem happy about it. Just then, Gerald pulled him over and introduced him to his grandmother, who hadn't seen him since he was a child. The old woman immediately warmed to him, wanting to get a good look at his face and see how much he had grown. Seeing no sign of danger, Laura should have been happy about this heartwarming reunion. But Gerald, as she remembered him, was either cold and ruthless or feigning politeness. So this reconciliation scene was nothing more than a theatrical performance to her. Then, Abigail asked her granddaughter to come closer and boasted to Gerald that the girl had been taking care of her with all her heart all this time. Her uncle just nodded, as if they had never been enemies. This whole charade of family bliss left Laura very confused. But whether it was a show or a genuine reconciliation, she really didn't care right now. Miss Pendleton just hoped her grandmother would remain calm and healthy. That evening, the Pendletons hosted a flawless family dinner. The heartwarming reunion between mother and son was the center of attention, along with the soon-to-be married couple. The bride's godfather also added to the warm atmosphere. The main topic at the dinner table was, naturally, the future bride and groom. Charles explained how, after graduating from university and working a law firm, he had unexpectedly chosen to become a clergyman. He spoke of the power of faith and kindness to overcome any challenge, earning many nods of approval. But Laura remembered his behavior before dinner and felt something was off. Still, she pushed those thoughts aside, just hoping the guest's visit would go smoothly. Later, she told a maid to buy more groceries for the next day. As she was about to return to her room, she heard her name called by the man she didn't want to talk to. She was surprised Mr. Price hadn't left yet. He explained that he had forgotten his gloves, but they were lying in plain sight, as if left there on purpose. Laura handed the gloves to Tom, and seeing the fellow, could barely restrain herself from speaking her mind. But Mr. Price was in no hurry to leave and confessed he had another request for Miss Pendleton. She thought he was about to start talking about marriage again, but instead he asked her to look after Joan and introduce her to London's high society. For the past 3 years, Joan had been the queen of American social circles, and now her goal was to conquer London. She was still a bit unpolished and lacked that English grace. Miss Pendleton swore she would do her best. After all, Miss Jensen was going to marry Charles. Mr. Price thanked her for this, but it looked like he had something else to say. Laura shuddered, thinking he was about to propose to her again. She was right. Tom started to kneel, but she immediately told him to stop and leave. Meanwhile, the maids were peeking from behind a door, ready to throw him out. The girl kept saying that no matter how many times Mr. Price proposed, her answer would always be no. The old fellow looked hurt, but asked her to at least give him a hint as to what he was lacking. It seemed he still held out hope, even though Laura had given him no reason to. He acted as if she had been flirting with him, leading him on, only to reject him now. After she refused again, Tom started to leave, but told her he would wait forever for her to say yes. After he left, Laura wondered how the earth could tolerate such a dense fool. But she could finally go back to her own space. All the stress was giving her another splitting headache. The girl was hoping to collapse onto her bed, only to be interrupted once again. She saw Gerald on the stairs, and he commented that she had been the perfect hostess today. He said it while looking straight into her eyes, with the exact same gaze as in the past. This gave Miss Pendleton a very bad feeling. Gerald complained that for 12 years, she had been playing the role of hostess by his mother's side, managing the house. Now he was curious why she wasn't married yet. She explained that she'd been unlucky in love, but her uncle suggested she just hadn't found a suitable husband yet. Laura swore she had never had such an outrageous thought. Her uncle said nothing, but as he walked past her, he told her not to get her hopes up. Don't expect to get anything from his mother, or even stay in this house. Then he grew even angrier, roaring that she should have found a way to support herself long ago. Alone, Miss Pendleton realized the old viper hadn't changed a bit. In his eyes, she was still that detestable freeloader, a pitiful little mouse deserving only of contempt. But Laura believed the day of her freedom would come, and when it did, she would gladly cast off the Pendleton name. The next morning, an unexpected visitor appeared at the townhouse. Joan Jensen had arrived, and she quickly looked around, declaring that she liked the place. She hadn't got a good look inside last time, but it was better than she had expected. Laura found it a bit odd that the lady would show up uninvited, claiming she just wanted to see the house. But hey, she was an American, right? Maybe that was normal there. It turned out, the reason Miss Jensen was so interested in the mansion was simple. The place was in the most sought-after neighborhood in London, and you needed connections and status to get in here. And for a pure American like Joan, getting in on her own was out of the question. She also wanted to know how old the house was and the history of the furniture. Miss Pendleton answered all her questions honestly, knowing that soon the house would belong to Miss Jensen, because once Mrs. Abigail passed away, Laura would be thrown out onto the street. Then, they had tea, and Joan admitted she wanted to break into London's high society immediately after marrying Charles, but she had no intention of juggling various duties and parish visits. When Charles proposed, he didn't promise Joan some shabby little house, but a proper townhouse on Grosvenor Street. This was largely the reason she had said yes. I mean, no other marriage could offer Miss Jensen this kind of advantage. Miss Pendleton couldn't understand how she could be so cheerful, knowing she was sitting across from someone who was about to be kicked out. But Joan didn't seem resentful or arrogant, though she probably didn't even know she was about to be kicked out. Gerald had likely spun her a different story. Then, Joan wanted to know where the best dressmakers were, as she had almost nothing to wear. She had initially packed 3 trunks, but lost them all on the way. But honestly, maybe it was for the best. Now she could wear the very latest styles. Laura explained that finding a dressmaker now was next to impossible, as it was the height of the social season and they were all booked up. Joan was excited to hear this and asked for a recommendation for a private dressmaker, as she only had a few dresses. Laura suggested Harrods, which had ready-to-wear clothes in very fashionable styles. Miss Pendleton even offered to take her and introduce her to the top designers. Joan thanked Laura and then suddenly declared that she was the perfect person to help her achieve her goals. Because for an American woman, becoming part of the British aristocracy was a priceless opportunity. Miss Jensen planned to conquer London within 3 years, and as Mrs. Joan Pendleton, it would all be much easier. Here, she would become a well-known figure and open the doors to European high society, which she would then conquer as well. The lady was very frank about using marriage as a means to conquer the European aristocracy. Still, she wasn't hypocritical like those socialites, just full of confidence and in tune with the spirit of the age. This Miss Joan Jensen was a true pirate in a skirt. Then, she bluntly asked Miss Pendleton to point out all her flaws without reservation and begged her to teach her English etiquette, promising to be completely obedient just to become equally elegant. Miss Pendleton smiled sweetly and promised to do her best. Besides, the boat race was coming up soon, and she could introduce Joan to her friends. A week later, it was the day of the race. When the ladies saw who was standing next to Miss Pendleton, they couldn't believe their eyes. They had just seen the same woman at the department store last week. Now, she looked completely different, like a proper Englishwoman. The girls approached Miss Pendleton and asked her to introduce her new friend. Laura was also happy to see everyone and began introducing the guests from America to them. But then, her eyes fell on a very familiar figure, and she almost thought she was mistaken. But squinting for a better look, she was certain that Mr. Dalton was right there in the crowd. When the crowd thinned a little and he turned his head towards her, Miss Pendleton was utterly speechless. In that moment, it felt as if the whole world consisted of just the two of them. Laura racked her brain, trying to figure out how on earth this man had gotten here. Joan brought her back to reality, noticing she was acting completely absent-minded. Laura was so flustered at that moment that she didn't even notice she had dropped her parasol. Realizing how badly she had zoned out, Miss Pendleton introduced Miss Jensen as the fiancée of her cousin, Charles. After that, the girls began to greet each other and fell into small talk. Joan was very pleased they had accepted her so warmly and admitted she had never been to London before. Laura chimed in that the atmosphere was wonderful, especially since Joan was such a fast learner of social graces. Still, you could tell she was used to being in high-end drawing rooms. Then Dora announced they were having a ball in a week and invited the American guests to attend. And just like that, Miss Lance, the most influential person here, was now completely on Joan's side. The doors to high society were open to Joan, and this would be her official debut. But then, Laura's thoughts drifted back to Mr. Dalton, who was still lingering nearby. He was supposed to be back in Whitefield, and Laura couldn't figure out what had brought him here. Dora spotted him too, and after excusing herself from her friends, she walked straight towards him. Joan asked who the man was, and Laura explained that he was a mutual friend. But when she saw Ian kiss Miss Lance's hand, something fell off. She then asked her friends how long Mr. Dalton had been in London, and was shocked to learn it had been over 2 weeks. The girls also revealed that a portrait painted by the man hung in Dora's drawing room, a painting of her and Miss Janet, and it was done the very day Mr. Dalton arrived in London. It was then that Laura noticed the atmosphere between Dora and Ian was different than before, though she couldn't say for sure if there were any romantic sparks between them. But you could definitely tell there was something between them. The girl looked down again, lost in thought, when she heard Mr. Dalton's voice cut through the noise. The man was standing right in front of her, as if there had never been any unpleasantness between them. And even though Laura remembered everything, she was still happy to see him standing there. After such a long separation, she composed herself and introduced him to Joan Jensen, the fiancée of her cousin, Charles. But when Ian heard she was the goddaughter of Mr. Price, a friend of her uncle's, his eyes sharpened. The name stirred something inside him again, but he still greeted both ladies politely. Laura was lost in thought again. She knew they would meet again, but she hadn't expected it so soon. Besides, it seemed to her that Mr. Dalton had absolutely no interest in her now. Still, maybe it was for the best. She had worried he might still have feelings for her. But the thought that she might have misunderstood everything from the start terrified her. After all, Ian hadn't said anything direct that day, and all his visits were just to dispel her illusions. Now, Miss Pendleton cursed herself for being so blind. Suddenly, Joan noticed she was pale and worried she might be unwell. Laura swore she was fine, just a little thirsty, which wasn't just an excuse. Every time she caught a glimpse of Mr. Dalton, she was filled with anxiety. So to calm herself down as quickly as possible, Miss Pendleton decided to get some water. Joan was still concerned and offered to go with her, but Laura refused. Mr. Dalton noticed all of this, and 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. Miss Pendleton had already drunk 2 glasses of water, but the tightness in her chest wouldn't go away. She tried to calm herself, but she knew that when Ian left London, she had finally admitted her feelings. She had promised herself she would let go, but now it only made her feel worse. She kept muttering to herself that she was just flustered and convinced herself that his heart already belonged to someone else. She needed to control her feelings and give up on love. But just then, her soul nearly leaped out of her body when she heard Mr. Dalton's voice behind her again. She looked at him in terror, as if she had seen a ghost. Ian noticed how much weight she had lost. It was very obvious up close. He even began to worry that Miss Pendleton was ill, especially as she stood there looking so pale. I mean, he had dreamed of seeing her every day, and now he had to control himself, which was pure torture. Ian held out a flower, the same kind as on her hat, and guessed she had dropped it. Laura started to panic, but Dalton told her to calm down, as no one else had noticed. Then, the man gathered his courage and asked for a minute of her time, which surprised her. Ian could barely hide his nervousness, explaining that he wanted to ask her for a very important favor.